Hello, my name is Helen Campbell, and I'm going to talk to you today about youth and voting. And I'm going to mention Mrs. May, the Prime Minister of the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition in the UK, and I will mention Brexit. I'm sure that you're familiar with all of those names, and I'm going to start now. In 2016, in the UK, a referendum was held about EU membership, whether the UK should stay in the EU or leave it. I campaigned very heavily indeed for the Remain camp. I wrote an article for a blog, a very popular blog, by the way, with students. And I was in the UK at several universities talking to students as well during the months leading up to the referendum. Now, I was supposed to be telling the students about careers with languages, but before I even started, I asked for a show of hands. How many of you, I asked, have actually registered to vote? And how many intend to vote? Out of about, say, 100, I was very disappointed to see it was maybe 10 or 20 who were going to vote. So I told them all, you tell your parents, your friends, your grandparents, everyone, vote Remain. It's in your interests, you young people, and your future. Well, we certainly all know what happened there. And I'm going to pick up the business of young people and voting in general now. At those meetings or university events, I could feel a certain indifference on the part of many of those students. Should we bother to vote? After all, this was just after the exams, and so people were celebrating and having parties. It didn't seem to matter to most of them. As a consequence, we know what happened, what the result of that referendum was. It was to leave. And had the young voted, I'm talking about the 18 to 24-year-olds, who should know better, had they voted, the outcome would certainly have been different. The vote would have been to stay in the EU. That, for me, is very sad. Now, I'm speaking to you in June 2017, and we've just had a general election in the UK. Mrs. May, as I speak, she is still the Prime Minister, was expecting a landslide victory. She was looking forward to this victory for being able to negotiate the Brexit the way she wanted. Mrs. May talked about a hard Brexit. And she hoped, with this election, to win the backing, win the support for that. Well, unfortunately for her, her opponent, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, did much better than expected. And she, much worse. Result was a hung parliament. Now, the interesting point here is that young people did turn out to vote, I'm glad to see. 80% this time. And they, the 18 to 24-year-olds, almost all voted for Jeremy Corbyn, Labour, not Mrs. May. Lots of reasons for that. One thing is that Mr. Corbyn had said he would abolish university fees if elected. Now, that's a very popular thing to say to students. Perhaps it's just also that young people are fed up with the person in power, fed up with the Conservative Party that is in government. And that would also be quite normal. But I'm jolly glad to see that at last young people are turning out to vote. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you've all heard the saying, time is money. And in the world of today, all of us sell our time as a commodity in exchange for money. However, the concept I want to talk to you about today is something that sees our time not as a commodity to sell, but as a currency in and of itself. And this is the concept of time banking or time banks, and it has been gaining popularity over the last 20 years. So what is a time bank? Time banks are an alternative banking system that use hours instead of money. As I said, they see time not as a commodity to sell, but as a currency that you can use in exchange for other services. Let me explain how they work. Time banks are community-based initiatives that encourage people to help other members of their community by sharing their skills. So, for example, you can provide manual labour such as gardening or cleaning, and in return receive services such as training in a foreign language or music lessons. The theory is that 1 hour is equal to 1 hour. So 1 hour of work in a skilled trade, such as electrical work, for example, is equivalent to 1 hour of a simple task, such as dog walking. Now, most time banks today are online platforms. All you have to do is find a time bank in your community, register as a user, and then decide what services you can offer. So if you speak a foreign language, you could offer language lessons, you could perhaps offer an hour of interpreting. And when somebody uses your services, you get an hour that you can put in your time bank, or 2 hours, however long you have spent on that service. Once you have banked your hours, you can then spend them on whatever services you choose that are available within your community time bank. Now, to give you some background on time banking, the first time bank was set up in the 1980s by a man named Edgar Kahn. Now, Edgar Kahn is a progressive lawyer who wanted to provide his legal services to poor people who could not afford to pay for them. However, what he found was that this idea of simply providing charity to people was in fact dispiriting and disempowering for the people he was trying to help. So what he did was set up a time bank. By doing this, he could still provide his free legal services, but in exchange, people were offering their skills in return. So rather than simply giving out charity, he was enabling the people who needed his help to feel as though they too were contributing something to their community. I'd like to give another good example about how time banks can make a huge difference in people's lives. The Portland Time Bank in the USA collaborates with a healthcare provider called True North. As you know, in the United States, there is no social security system, so there are many people who are uninsured or underinsured. However, the collaboration between Portland Time Bank and True North means that members of the time bank can provide services and bank the hours that they have earned by providing these services, and then use their hours to provide healthcare or to buy healthcare for themselves or for a family member. And through this scheme, through this collaboration between True North and the Portland Time Bank, 25,000 hours of healthcare have been provided. So this is hours of healthcare that has been provided to people that would otherwise be unable to afford it. Now, according to the US non-profit organisation Time Banks USA, there are currently over 300 registered time banks around the world. And these can range hugely in size. The smallest registered time bank has just 15 members, and the largest, a huge 3,000. So the number of members and the number of services available can vary greatly depending on the time bank. Now, in an economy that uses time as a currency, all of us are equal. Time banks can help to reduce inequality and strengthen community spirit, solidarity and cooperation. Now, time is unlikely to take over from our traditional currencies anytime soon. However, such time banking initiatives help to make our world and our communities kinder, more inclusive and fairer places to live. Thank you.
My name is Hannah. I'm a trainee at the Commission, and I'm going to talk to you today about the volunteering industry and whether we are doing more harm than good by volunteering in developing countries. And I'm going to start my speech now. Taking a year out to do some volunteering has in the last 10 to 15 years become very, very popular, particularly in the Western world. Whether it is volunteering as a teacher in Kenya, or working in an orphanage in Brazil, or working with elephants in Thailand. The concept of volunteering has existed for centuries, but I'm going to start off by telling you about how the modern day the concept came about and the idea of organisations sending out volunteers. So it started shortly after the First World War with the intention of building ties and understanding between different nationalities. The first camp was organised in 1920 and brought together volunteers from former enemy countries to rebuild a ruined French village. This project was based on unity, bringing people together from different countries and making a difference to a local community. And this concept still exists today and is the foundation for organisations. But the idea has now developed, spread worldwide, and along the way, I believe that it has become a huge tourism industry. From my experience and my research, I have found it difficult to find volunteer programs that are non-profit, transparent, you can see where the money goes, and that has these values. It is not uncommon to pay hundreds or sometimes thousands of euros for a few weeks, for a project that lasts a few weeks. To meet this new demand of volunteers, websites and organisations offering volunteering experiences have appeared on the market. Therefore they are changing, due to the volume of organisations, they are changing the face of volunteering. It's becoming, in some cases, it is becoming more of a business, an intention to make huge profits, for example. And this leads us to the question, how much money goes to profit and how much money, and also sustainable, thought out, structured projects goes to the local communities. In recent years, we have started to see the effect that the volunteering industry has had on local communities, where in some cases it is doing more harm than good. And we have, however, started also to look at more effective and sustainable ways of conducting these projects. For example, untrained and unqualified young people working as teachers may not be suitable due to their inexperience. There are now more projects to train local teachers or to work alongside local teachers rather than instead of them. And I would also like to tell you a short anecdote which also backs up this concept. I know of a volunteer who went to Tanzania to help build a school, and the volunteers would complain about the locals that they were lazy, that they slept in the mornings. But however, towards the end of the project, they found out that the local people would go back to the school that they were building and rebuild what the volunteers had done during the day because the volunteers did not do it properly. So this shows that they do not need volunteers for this project, that they need funding, or again, for the volunteers to work alongside the locals rather than instead of them. So all in all, this is not to say that I think volunteering is a bad idea. I think it is essential to bring people together from different backgrounds. However, I think that people need to be very careful when selecting an organisation, that the organisation and the volunteer make sure that the volunteer is matched to a project according to the person's skills, and that the volunteer can see where the money goes. And finally, that the volunteer makes sure that that the project will benefit the community as much as it benefits themselves. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Brian Gentle, and I'm going to make a short speech for you on the subject of military spending, in particular in the context of NATO. And I'll begin now. Ladies and gentlemen, the Western military organisation NATO was created during the Cold War as a platform to guarantee defence in case of an invasion of what we now call Western Europe. Obviously, at the time, with the Iron Curtain in place, there was a fear that Russia and its allies, or the Soviet Union, to be more accurate, might attack at any time. A fear which, fortunately, today is no longer an issue. Yet, despite that, NATO still exists. You might ask yourself, why? Largely, the reason is to do with the United States. The US still keeps it in place because it provides the political influence, and it also provides the financial backing. But why, you may ask, does the United States want to spend money on NATO? Let me suggest two reasons why. The first reason is, by pumping money into NATO, the United States guarantees that any wars will take place outside its own territory. It's far better for its own nationals if wars take place in Vietnam or Afghanistan or even in parts of Europe. At least every dollar spent keeping wars outside the United States is a dollar well spent. The second reason I would suggest is that the Americans want to have a political influence in Europe. And if they're paying for NATO, it brings us back to the old saying of he who pays the piper calls the tune. Europe at the same time has, for decades actually, been quite happy to hide behind the American shield. Because it has to be said that although NATO countries all cooperate together, and the smallest, like Luxembourg, has the same vote as the largest, the United States, yet still, de facto, it's the Americans who provide the money and the hardware. And when Donald Trump recently told the Allied armies and navies that they had to increase their spending in order to match the US, at least in percentage terms, it was a kind of wake-up call for Europe, reminding Europe how much it at the moment depends on American military spending. Now, American spending on defence is huge. In the last year, the figure was 600 billion United States dollars. That's in 2018. That is more than the defence budgets of China, Russia, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy all put together. And in that year, America even increased its spending by another 50 billion. Of course, this is good news for the defence industry, who are very happy to receive funding from the US and from NATO partners. And many of these defence industries are actually located in Europe. They include household names which you would not necessarily associate with defence, like Airbus or Rolls-Royce, for example. But in fact, the biggest European defence company is British Aerospace, who have a whopping turnover of $25.5 billion per year. Now, leaving to one side for a moment the ethics of military spending, you might at least feel comfortable in thinking, well, at least our armies all are well equipped. Now, unfortunately, that's not 100% true. Understandably, governments strictly control military spending because they don't want the army to run away and start to run the country. But government control on spending is both complicated and time-consuming. And it means that sometimes the spending on military issues gets into difficulties because of pure bureaucracy. As a result, some forces end up with the most modern equipment, but not the software to run it. And that is most difficult for the troops concerned. I think that defence is important to act as a deterrent to stop others from coming in. But obviously spending on defence has to be always a very careful balance between strength on the one hand and diplomacy on the other. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Helen Campbell. I am a retiree of the European Commission and SCIG, and I'm going to talk to you today about going back to work and office space. And I'll start now. Now, after 2 years of the pandemic that we've all lived through, we begin to hear that people are now actually going back to work. In many cases, this will probably mean white-collar workers returning to the office, or perhaps to a school or university. But not everybody is happy about going back to work. And so to lure them back, to make the return more attractive, some businesses are offering free lunches, free drinks, even a free massage. But if and when people do return, how will they feel about their working environment? How will they feel about their space where they're working 2 years later? Now, here's a little anecdote, which I think will illustrate the point how important one's environment is. The great modern architect Le Corbusier, a century ago, was commissioned to design homes for factory workers in Bordeaux, in France. Now, the result was much as you would expect from this architect. Very modern, large blocks, block colours, modern for then, but actually for now too. But the factory workers all refused to move in. Later on, those who did move in decided to change things, added shutters and gardens and tried to make the atmosphere a little less austere and a bit more cosy. I think this illustrates how much our environment is important for how we feel, how we work, and whether we're creative and productive or not. Now, of course, it's easy for managers and directors general sitting in their large corner offices, but they should take this issue very seriously. And they should perhaps look at an experiment carried out in 2010 by 2 psychologists. This is what they did. They had a group of participants who were asked to perform simple administrative tasks in different office spaces. 4 different layouts were chosen. The first was very minimalist and stripped down, with just a bare desk and a swivel chair and a pen and paper. The second was the same office space but decorated with a few pots of plants and some pictures. The participants generally preferred the second layout. As to the third and fourth layouts, well, they looked similar, but they produced very different outcomes. In each space, the participants concerned were invited to place pictures and plants wherever they liked before they began working. But in one case, the room was decorated by the participant, and then the project manager came in and rearranged the whole thing. So the physical difference was minimal, but the results were huge, vastly different. It turned out that workers want to be empowered to shape their own space. If they do so, they will work better, be more productive and happier. If they are disempowered, they will do less well and they will be less productive. So it isn't just the environment that counts. It's the control that is really important. Now, as a former SCIC interpreter, but also administrator, I can relate to that. I remember that I had a nice office which was decorated as I wished, and then I went away on mission for a week. I returned to find a large, ugly cupboard had been placed in my office. I was very unhappy about this indeed. In fact, I made such a fuss that it was removed very quickly and placed elsewhere. Another experiment that I remember involved working in an open plan environment. I was working in Germany at the time, and the office space was classic at the beginning, so small offices. I had my own. Then the company moved elsewhere, and we moved into this open plan, which everyone detested. Years later, the open plan scheme was dropped by most companies, and individual offices returned. But I understand that now it's back yet again to the open plan. I just hope that everybody will look at the past and try and learn from it. It is the control and the empowerment that contribute most to happiness and to productivity. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We live in a world where everything that we buy is disposable, whether it's clothes, shoes, furniture, perhaps a new piece of technology. Once something is past its best or once it stops working, it tends to be cheaper and easier just to throw it away and buy a new one. Now let me give you some examples. Every year in the United Kingdom, approximately 300,000 tonnes of clothing is thrown away. The average lifespan for a piece of clothing, again in the United Kingdom, is just over 3 years. And we throw things away because they go out of fashion, perhaps because they're poor quality and they don't look very nice after they've been washed a couple of times. We throw them away because they've got a stain on that we can't get rid of, or perhaps because they no longer fit us. And it's not just clothing that we throw away. Around the world, every year, 50 million tonnes of electronic waste is thrown away. Now, the reasons behind this are partly that we as consumers want or are told that we want the latest in technology. But there are also concerns about what is known as built-in obsolescence, which is where manufacturers design their products to break down after a certain amount of time. And they intentionally make them difficult or expensive to fix so that we have to buy a new product once it has stopped working. Now, of course, throwing away all of these products, whether it's clothes, whether it's technological items, has a huge impact on our environment. And there is one organisation that rejects this throwaway culture and aims to tackle this trend, that aims to make sure that we get the most out of our products by increasing their lifespan. And the name of this organisation is Repair Cafe. The first Repair Cafe was set up 10 years ago in Amsterdam, and now it has grown into a non-profit foundation that operates in 36 different countries. Now, Repair Cafes, or the Repair Cafe organisation, aims to minimise waste. It aims to help us use resources responsibly, but at the same time to connect people in a new and an inspiring way. Repair Cafe addresses a problem that many of us will recognise, that many of you here will recognise. The things that we own, the things that we buy at some point age or break, And when they do, we often don't know what we can do with them, and so we just throw them away. The reason for this is that it can often be very expensive to have something fixed by a professional. In fact, in many places, it's almost impossible to find a professional who can fix your items for you. And we as individuals tend not to have the repair skills or the tools or the time to do it ourselves. And so this is where repair cafes step in. So let me tell you a little bit about repair cafes individually, about the specific way that they work. Now we talk about, or the organisation is called Repair Cafe, but we're not actually talking about a physical cafe. Repair cafes are actually events, so think of it like a pop-up shop that happen at a particular place in a city. So they might take place in a different part of the city or a different part of the town every month. And a repair cafe is a free meeting organised by and for ordinary people. So like I said, they can be held in a different place, in a community centre, in a local cafe, in a park even. And once the date and the place has been established, volunteers who have the skills to repair different items pledge to give up their time to come and fix items that are brought in. So it could be a tailor or a cobbler or a carpenter or an electrician, a bike mechanic, and so on and so forth. And then when other residents of that town, of that city, have something that they need to be fixed, they can bring it in to the repair cafe and have it fixed for free by a professional. Now, it doesn't just stop with having an item fixed. When you bring something in, the philosophy of the repair cafe is also to bring people together. And so when you bring something in to be fixed, you sit next to the person who is fixing your item. And whatever it is you've brought in gets repaired in front of your eyes. This hopefully means that you learn a little bit about how to do repairs yourself, so that perhaps next time you can fix things on your own. So while you're there, while you're at the repair cafe, you get to have a chat, have a cup of coffee with somebody new. So these repair cafes can help establish community bonds. And as another reward, you get to go home with an object that is no longer broken and can be used again, because repair cafes manage to fix approximately 70% of the items that are brought in. So in conclusion, I believe that the repair cafe movement is an inspiring movement that really deserves our support. They exist in many different countries, so take a look online, do some research to find out if there is one near you. If there isn't already one in your city, in your country, you might want to think about organising one. And once you've found a repair cafe close by, if you yourself have the skills to repair things yourself, why not volunteer to attend a repair cafe? If you don't have those skills, next time you're going to throw something out because it's broken, take the time to think about whether it might be possible to fix it and take it to a repair cafe yourself. By doing so, you can save yourself money and also help to reduce your impact on the environment. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Earlier this year, I decided that I was going to learn Irish. I am from Ireland, but I have never actually learned the language. I didn't learn it growing up. But I decided that this year was the year that I was going to do it. There's one small problem though, and that is that I live in Switzerland. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the amount of native speakers of Irish in Switzerland is, well, around about zero. The amount of native speakers of Irish, even in Ireland, is still very low, but you're not going to have an awful lot of luck in Switzerland. So I had to resort to alternative means, and one method that I'm particularly enjoying at the moment is an application called Duolingo. Now, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to try it, but it gives you the opportunity to learn a wide range of languages, or at least if you're going into English, there are a wide range of languages available. There are at least 36 languages available into English. Some of them are quite obvious, for example, French and Spanish and German and Portuguese. But you also have somewhat more unusual languages, well, including Irish, but also Klingon and Navajo. And I think it's great because it gives you access to languages that you wouldn't normally be able to learn, or certainly depending on where you live, you might not have the opportunity to learn them. The app itself is very fun to use, I think so, and it makes use of a very common strategy nowadays called gamification, which basically means that if you get the answers right, then you'll get points. And that allows you to compete. You can compete against your friends, or you can compete on a public leaderboard and see if you get into the next league. And I think that that makes it a very enjoyable thing to do. And I have to admit that after approximately 3 weeks of using Duolingo, I definitely understand bits of Irish and the concepts of Irish an awful lot better than I did before I started. The problem is that I can see, even at this stage, that there's a limit to how far you can go with this application. And that became apparent to me when I was doing the lesson on verbs. And they gave me a sentence which in English translated into, "I am not a duck." Yes, you heard that correctly. I am not a duck. And when I heard this phrase, I thought, well, that's not very useful, is it? There are certain things that maybe make sense. Maybe duck was a good word to use because of the grammar. Maybe they're just trying to teach me new vocabulary. But practically, if your aim is to not seem stark raving mad, you aren't going to be running around saying, "I am not a duck," to people on a daily basis. So I decided I would compare what they do in Irish with what they do in languages I already know. So I changed my account and I tried French and Spanish, and I tried their higher level test. And I was right, there are limits involved because, for example, one of the main problems is that when you get more advanced, they only can accept the responses that they have programmed into the system. And if you give an alternative answer that is all the same right, they might well mark it wrong, which can get quite frustrating. That said, Duolingo has been extremely successful, and whilst I might be criticising its ability to make you completely fluent in the language, the founder, it has to be said, never intended for that to be its purpose. The founder is a man called Luis von Ahn, and he was born in Guatemala, where he noticed that it was very difficult for people to learn English. Very expensive. However, he decided it would all the same be useful for people to have those skills. So he thought that he would develop a way that would be free and easy and that would give people the basics of English. It has since then been an astronomical success, and it now has over 200 employees and, according to one source, more than 27.5 million active users every month. And what they aim to do is to be as addictive as possible. If you've ever used it, you will know that the app has a little bird, an avatar, which pops up every single day to remind you to use the application. And it can become quite irritating. It really is quite insistent, telling you to log in and complete a lesson or just top up your points on this section. Now, what that does do is it maintains a very high interest, which, as we all know, is a key factor in learning a language. However, it's not necessarily very useful for improving your level, which is limited by the very nature of the application. Whilst learning a language through Duolingo is probably not going to be very useful whenever you go to open a bank account, it might be helpful when you're trying to navigate a situation on holiday, such as reading a menu, or, if the worst should come to the worst, to repeat rather insistently that I am not a duck. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Guy Laycock. I'm an interpreter at the SCIC in the European Commission, and I'd like to give you a speech now about Greece, about its a brief speech about its history and its economy. And I'll begin now. Greece is currently in crisis, but Greece is also known to us not only as the crisis country of the Eurozone, but it's been known to us for longer as the cradle of European civilization, which is perhaps the way in which the Greeks would prefer to be known. And this is no coincidence, because there are very strong geographical reasons for civilization coming to Europe via Greece. Greece was simply the part of Europe which was nearest to the ancient civilizations of the Middle East, in the Nile, in the Nile Valley in ancient Egypt and in Mesopotamia. So how did civilization first come to Greece? Well, the answer, of course, is by trade. If you've ever been to Greece, you'll know that it's a very mountainous country with low rainfall, hot summers, ideal for tourism, and also that's ideal for the production of olives and grapes. But it's not ideal for the production of vital staple crops, such as cereals, which you need to feed the population. So from ancient times, Greece was forced to trade because it couldn't grow these vital staple crops itself. It was forced to trade with other countries. And Greek merchants traded wine and olive oil, which the Greeks were very good at producing, for cereals grown on the other side of the Mediterranean in the Nile Delta. But Egypt, of course, was on the other side of the sea, the Mediterranean, so the Greeks were forced to build ships to trade with the Egyptians. And that was the beginning of Greece's history as a maritime nation, a seafaring nation. But the Greeks didn't just use the ships they built to trade with the Egyptians. They used them to explore beyond the eastern Mediterranean, and they established trading colonies as far west as southern Italy and the south of France. Looking at the Greek economy today, we can see that Greece is still very much a maritime nation. It has the third largest merchant fleet in the world. It has a fishing fleet of 20,000 vessels, which land 150,000 tons of fish and seafood every year. And that's 15% of the total fisheries yield from the Mediterranean. On top of the merchant fleet and the fishing fleet, you also have a very large fleet of ferries in Greece, which transport people and vehicles between the Greek mainland and the 150 inhabited Greek islands. So Greece is still very much a maritime nation. And another aspect of the Greek economy that hasn't changed since ancient times is the importance of olives. Olives and olive oil are still a mainstay of the Greek economy. Every year, Greece harvests around 2 million tons of olives. That's 17% of world olive production. And Greek olive oil also enjoys a reputation of high quality, of in fact being the best olive oil in the world. If you look at the percentage of Greek olive oil production that qualifies for the top quality category, it's 75%. And that is a higher proportion than in other olive oil producing countries. For example, if you go west from Greece, it's only 50% of Italian olive oil qualifies for that top category, and further west, only 30% of Spanish olive oil qualifies for the top quality category. There are some things that have changed in Greece since ancient times, thanks to artificial irrigation. Now Greece, rather like Israel, is able to produce a large variety of fruit and vegetables in what was previously fairly barren terrain. So Greece produces a much greater variety of agricultural products than it did in ancient times, and that includes tobacco. It also includes very high quality cotton, which is regarded as the second best quality cotton in the world after Egyptian cotton. In terms of industry, the Industrial Revolution rather passed Greece by. There's no heavy industry there. There's no coal mining, the things we typically associate with industry. But Greece does have some light industry, and it also has some deposits of other metal ores other than iron ore, such as bauxite, which is an ore of aluminium. I mentioned at the beginning that Greece is often referred to as the cradle of European civilization, and that's one of the reasons, together with its very pleasant climate, why it's become a centre for tourism. It has a very large tourism sector. So I would conclude perhaps with a helpful and pleasant recommendation, which is that this year we think about spending our holidays in Greece so that we can become more educated Europeans, finding out about the origins of our own civilization, while at the same time helping to correct the current economic imbalance between Northern Europe and Southern Europe.
Hello. Today my subject will be China and wine. Just by way of introduction, I'll mention a few terms I'll be using in this speech. I'll be referring to the wine regions of Bordeaux and Sauternes, to wine companies Moët et Hennessy and Château Lafite, and to the European Commissioners Karel de Gucht and Damien Cholos. Ladies and gentlemen, you may remember that in 2013, the European Union decided to impose anti-dumping duties on solar panels from China that were being imported into the EU. China responded by threatening to investigate complaints from Chinese wine producers that European producers were dumping their products onto the Chinese market. Now, it came as a surprise to many people that the Chinese even import European wine. It was even more of a surprise to many to learn that China actually produces wine, but this turns out to be true. In fact, China is now the world's largest market for red wine. In 2013, Chinese consumers bought nearly 2 billion bottles of red wine. And that's an increase of 136% over the past 5 years. Now, why have the Chinese begun drinking more wine? And why do they like red wine in particular? Only a few years ago, red wines were usually drunk only by wealthy business people, at banquets, perhaps to celebrate sealing an important business deal. Now, however, there's a new group of consumers who are discovering European wines. Younger, prosperous people in China's growing cities are drinking wine and serving it to their friends to demonstrate their sophistication. And this is all part of a broader trend towards the westernization of Chinese culture. Wines from France make up 48% of wine imports into China, and red wine from Bordeaux is currently the most fashionable drink among China's elites. Wine tasting courses have become very popular. Currently, wine consumption in China is only about 1 bottle per person per year. But given the country's huge population, the potential for growth is enormous. One French study predicted that the Chinese will increase their wine drinking by 40% between 2012 and 2016. As for why the Chinese prefer red wine, red is of course the color of the Chinese flag. It's considered a lucky color in China. It's the color of power and wealth. White, meanwhile, is associated with death and mourning, and this may explain why white wines are less popular in China. But as I said, China not only imports wines, it also has its own vintages. The quality of Chinese wines varies widely, however, and at the moment there are very few Chinese wines that can compete with European wines in terms of quality. In the 1990s, Chinese wines were often compared to cough syrups or paint thinners, but they are improving. And in 2011, a Chinese wine even won a competition for Bordeaux wines. Such wines are still the exception, however. It's simply not easy to make good wine in China. One of the problems is a shortage of high-quality wine grapes. The grapes available are simply not sweet enough to produce interesting wine flavors. Therefore, most of the wine that's produced in China is insubstantial in flavor and dry rather than sweet. China's geography is also an obstacle. China is such a large country that we might assume that it must have some areas that are ideal for growing wine. Unfortunately, for China, this isn't the case. The grapes from which red wine are made require dry growing conditions. Too much moisture causes them to develop mold and diseases. China does have dry regions, but they're also very cold in the winter. So cold that wine growers must bury their vines so that they'll survive through the winter. And this makes growing expensive and shortens the life of the plants. China is nonetheless now the world's number 5 wine producer, and its production is expected to double within 5 years. Now I'd like to go on and tell you a bit more about the French reaction to China's increased wine production, but I'll stop here and leave that for another day. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking about the growing health problems affecting many mothers in the USA today. I'll mention the United Nations Sustainability Goals, or SDGs for short. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all well aware of the dangers surrounding childbirth. We also know that infant mortality is a more serious problem in the developing world than in the developed world. The problem is indeed so serious that the United Nations decided to devote one of its Sustainability Development Goals to it. SDG 3.2 talks about reducing infant mortality in the first 27 days of life to 12 deaths per 1,000 births, and in the first 5 years of life to 25 deaths per 1,000 births. Both these targets are to be achieved by 2030. These are, of course, global targets, and it will be far easier for developed countries to reach them than for developing ones. However, in the developed world, and in particular in the United States, the issue appears to be more about keeping the mothers alive rather than their children. And yes, you did hear me correctly. In fact, the maternal mortality rate in the United States of America, which is often hailed as the leader of the free world, is the highest of any country in the developed world. According to the latest statistics, for every 100,000 births in the United States, as many as 24 mothers die, compared to just 7 in the United Kingdom, where I was born, and where my mother survived, thankfully, and as few as 5 in Belgium, where I'm sitting now. So what factors explain this great disparity between the US and other comparable developed nations? As always, when discussing societal phenomena, there are numerous factors at play. Firstly, there are relatively high rates of a number of chronic diseases in the US population compared to many European countries. I'm talking here about obesity, about diabetes, and heart disease, to name but a few. Secondly, there are more deliveries by caesarean section in the United States, and such deliveries are always risky for both the mothers and their babies. And thirdly, there's the eternal problem of inadequate health care in America, especially for poorer Americans. For example, the subsidized health care that is offered to the poorest mothers in America ends just 60 days after a woman has given birth, while many serious health conditions can come to light later than that. There is, however, a fourth and more recent factor which threatens to make the situation even worse. I'm referring to the US Supreme Court's decision to overturn an earlier ruling that abortion was a constitutional right for women in America. This now leaves the door open for individual states to ban abortion and allow only limited exceptions to it. Regarding those exceptions, medical professionals are taking a very cautious approach to applying them for fear of prosecution. As we know, there is a strong tradition of court litigation in the US. For example, one exception is when the woman's life is in danger. However, the law is not always absolutely clear as to how immediate that danger to the mother's life has to be. For example, if a woman develops cancer during pregnancy and thus chooses to have an abortion, will the provider of that abortion be taken to court because the mother was not in immediate danger of dying of cancer? No one can say for sure. As a result of this, many women who choose to have an abortion in America are having to shop around to find a state whose laws allow the abortion to take place. In one recent case, a woman who was denied an abortion in Texas was advised to fly to Colorado for the procedure. She had to travel at her own expense while she was ill with a condition that was serious, but not considered life-threatening enough for the abortion to be performed in her home state of Texas. Alas, such situations are expected to become increasingly common in America over the next few years. Ladies and gentlemen, being born in the US offers American children a privileged start in life that is denied to those born in many other places around the world. But for all the reasons that I have mentioned, it is far from the easiest place on earth to become a mother. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, I'm going to be talking today about transmutation. Now, it sounds rather complicated. In fact, it's a way of treating nuclear waste material to make it less dangerous and easier to store. And I promise you, I won't get too complicated. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we're all familiar with the saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That is certainly true as far as energy generation is concerned. When we produce energy, it is always at a price. For example, if we burn fossil fuels, what do we get? CO2 emissions. If we build dams, for example, in order to produce hydroelectric power, we can end up destroying the ecology of entire river basins and valleys. And if we produce nuclear energy in a nuclear power station, what do we get? Well, we get lots of carbon-free energy, yes, but we also get a lot of radioactive waste material, material which has to be disposed of safely, perhaps for as long as 10,000 years, while it remains radioactive. And it's this disposal issue which means that many people who might otherwise welcome and embrace nuclear energy as a clean, carbon-free energy source, they tend to be shying away from nuclear energy because of the waste disposal problem. The current most favoured solution for disposal of nuclear waste is to bury it in the ground, to treat it, perhaps vitrify it, seal it and bury it deep underground in so-called geological repositories. The only problem with this solution is nobody wants to have such a geological repository anywhere near where they live. And the difficulties in finding suitable locations for depositories mean that, as I say, many people who would otherwise welcome nuclear energy feel that we have to look elsewhere for carbon-free energy generation. Elsewhere means, for example, renewables, energy sources such as wind power or solar power. We also, of course, have to be more aware these days of energy efficiency and energy conservation. Now, of course, renewables are important, and energy efficiency, energy conservation is extremely important. But I believe that if we are to have a chance of averting the dangers of climate change, while still enjoying the standard of living that we are used to or that we aspire to, then we're going to have to continue to rely on nuclear energy. So, what to do about the waste disposal problem? One solution that has been around for a couple of decades, since the 1990s, is transmutation. The basic idea is that you put the radioactive waste material into a machine and then you bombard it with a beam of high energy subatomic particles. You smash it up into much more stable products with shorter half-lives. The waste would still need to be stored, but it would be much less hazardous, and the half-life, as I say, would be reduced. It wouldn't have to be stored for so long. But the real beauty of the transmutation process is that it could actually be used to produce new, fresh energy. Transmutation could actually generate more energy than is used in operating the transmutation process. The heat generated by splitting the waste nuclei could be used to generate electricity. Part of that could be used to run the particle accelerator for the transmutation, and the rest could be fed into the national grid, the electricity grid. As I say, the idea of transmutation has been around since the 1990s. If it could be made to work, it could go a long way towards helping people come to terms with nuclear energy as a major source of carbon-free energy on into the future. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Brian Gentle, and I'm going to make a short speech about what are the top states in the European Union. There are no particularly difficult points of terminology in this speech, and I'll begin now. Ladies and gentlemen, arguably Angela Merkel has been the longest-serving head of government that the European Union has ever seen, even beating Margaret Thatcher, as she is now in her 12th year as German Chancellor. Yet it seems as if her best times have come to an end because of the way that she handled the crisis amongst migrants in Germany. She has lost a lot of her credibility, and maybe therefore her star is on the wane. But while her star is waning, the president of the other motor country of the European Union, namely France's Emmanuel Macron, seems to be seeing his star being on the rise. And this despite all the economic and social problems that he has had to face in recent weeks back in France. The landslide victory that his party, La République En Marche, managed to garner back in 2017 put Macron in a very strong position. As a result, he has been able to push through some unpopular, but I would suggest necessary, legislation to reform labour law and the laws regarding social security. even though he had to backtrack in some ways in giving back some of the taxes that he had introduced on energy products. So, ladies and gentlemen, does that now mean that Emmanuel Macron is the new Merkel? Is he the one you have to try and convince if you want something done in the European Union? Well, I'd like to suggest that that's possibly not the case, simply because France lacks something that Germany has, namely a strong economic and financial position. The reason why people would go and ask Merkel what she thought about policy before making proposals was that she effectively held the purse strings. Of course, the European Union's budget is a multinational budget, but it is Germany that is the biggest net contributor. So therefore, others are careful in making proposals which Germany is likely to be unhappy about. Let me give you an example. President Macron proposed recently that the European Union should have its own finance minister, and also that the Eurozone should have a budget all to itself. But this has been met by stony silence from the German side, which maybe is surprising, because though Germany generally is a country that is in favour of expanding the European Union, of deepening it and strengthening it, on this occasion Germany felt that the proposal was a step too far. Most Germans were afraid that Macron's proposal simply meant that France wanted Germany to pay for its own budget deficit. So what kind of conclusion can we draw from all this? Well, maybe the first thing to say would be that it is not so much that Merkel is the go-to person in the European Union, but rather that Germany is the go-to country within the EU. And of course, having one country which holds sway over everything is perhaps not an ideal situation. We don't want a unilateral EU leadership. The EU is based on being a partnership, all the countries of the European Union working together. And if one country tries to throw its weight about, that would only upset others, and in the worst case scenario might lead to a slow or even a rapid disintegration of the European Union. That's why Germany does not in any way strive to be the top player within the EU, and itself doesn't look for being dominant. Because after all, despite the fact that it is de facto the strongest country, any weakening of the EU would in the first instance hurt the motor nations of the EU, i.e. Germany and France, the most. Thank you.
Okay, this is the introduction, so you don't have to interpret this bit. The speech is about the 30 Years' War and about Sweden, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about either. I'll mention a couple of names. First of all, the Varangian Guard, that's Varangian Guard, and Constantinople, Byzantium, depending on what term you're more familiar with. And I'll talk about somebody called Gustavus Adolphus, who was a king of Sweden. And I think everything else should be fairly self-explanatory, and I'll start in a few seconds. Dear colleagues, a short while ago, while I was doing some research on something completely unrelated, I found out that apparently in Poland, mothers still scare small children by telling them that if they don't behave, the Swedes are going to come and get them. I don't know whether this is true or not, and I don't know whether it actually has any impact on small Polish children and whether they eat their vegetables without complaining and go to sleep early because otherwise the Swedes will get them. By the way, if you're a small child, I definitely would recommend obeying what your parents say and going to bed early. Not that I did when I was a small child. More seriously, however, it's amusing to think that it's even possible to be scared of Swedes nowadays, or that Swedes could have a reputation that is somehow scary. I wouldn't want to insult anybody Swedish who's listening at the moment, but nowadays, if people think about Sweden, well, they might think about neutrality. They might think about a very well-organized and efficient country, a very nice country. I suppose if they felt a bit negative, they might feel that Swedes tend to be a bit bossy. I mean, there's, for instance, a rather famous small Swedish girl that goes around telling everybody how to save the planet, who's quite famous at the moment. And, of course, like most Swedes, she's probably right. But, again, that's one of the cliches about Swedes, that they're possibly people who think they know better than you do and tend to be a bit bossy. I'm married to a Swede, so I couldn't possibly comment. However, one thing that Swedes are not is scary. The only scary thing in Sweden is if you buy alcohol and you look at the bill. But apart from that, as I said, Sweden has a reputation not only for neutrality, but for generally being a non-scary country. So where does this reputation in Poland apparently come from? Well, if you go back in history, of course, you will be aware that the Swedes, being Scandinavian, were also Vikings, same as the Norwegians and the Danes. In Western Europe, we tend to be more familiar with the Vikings that attacked Britain and Ireland and France and the whole of the coastline all the way down to the Mediterranean. Now, those Vikings tended to come from Norway or Denmark. The Swedish Vikings went east, up the Baltic, to places like Poland, the Baltic states, and the Ukraine and Russia. In fact, depending on how you interpret history, you can say that a lot of the early kingdoms in those areas, in particular the first kingdom in Russia, might have been started by people who could technically be tied into Swedish origin. But it's quite controversial, so I'm not going to start an argument with our Russian friends about that. The Swedish Vikings actually went very far east and also south. They went all the way down to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, apparently, and they went down to Byzantium, to Constantinople. Indeed, at one point, the elite soldiers of the Emperor of Constantinople, his personal bodyguard, were the Varangian Guard, who were mainly recruited from people we would nowadays call Swedes. However, the real reputation of the Swedes as scary people in Eastern Europe came during the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War, as its name suggests, lasted for 30 years, between 1618 and 1648. I'm not going to go into the details, but it devastated a large part of Central and Eastern Europe. And one of the great leaders on one side was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, who was a very, very far-sighted military commander and is still probably one of the great European military leaders if you study military history. And at that time, the Swedes had a fearsome reputation, and it's based on that in parts of Eastern Europe, people still talk about them. And it's probably based on that, if it's true, that in Poland they used the threat of Swedes to scare small children. Times have changed a great deal, and as I've said, the Swedes don't scare you anymore. They just send Greta Thunberg to lecture you about the future of the planet, which is probably a good thing, unlike whatever they used to do during the 30 Years' War. Having said that, I recently read that the Swedish government has decided to start boosting defense spending because of the recent behavior of Russia. and that they're going to actually start improving their military. So who knows? The Swedes might suddenly start becoming scary again. And that might actually be a good thing. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Owen Ward from the English Language Unit. Today I'm going to give you a speech about the European Social Fund. You don't have to start interpreting yet. I'll make it very clear when I start my speech. I'll just give you some vocabulary first, which I think will be very useful. First of all, the ESF, the European Social Fund. I'll talk about some young people who are known as NEETs, so people who are not in education, employment or training. They're from a disadvantaged background, another piece of vocabulary that might be useful. I have another acronym which may be of use, which is FASW, First Aid and Safety at Work. And then I speak about the French Labour Code, which is like the French labour law. And without further ado, I'll get started. My speech begins now. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the vast majority of the work that we carry out at international organisations as interpreters, about 99% of the work that we do, is simultaneous. That means that we're in a booth. But every now and then, especially if you have a retour, you also have to do some consecutive interpreting. So you have to use a notepad and go out into the field and actually take notes, like you're doing now. Recently, I was working in Paris for 3 days. I was at a 3-day meeting, and most of the meeting took place in a conference centre, in booths. But one afternoon, we had to go out and visit a project, and there I had to do consecutive. Now, the topic of the meeting in general was the ESF, the European Social Fund. This is a pot of money which comes from the European Commission, and the aim of this particular budget is to improve education, employability and skills, especially for young people and people from a disadvantaged background. As part of this meeting, we went and visited a project which receives funds from the European Social Fund. It was on the outskirts of Paris on a military base. And this project receives money from the ESF to provide training to young people. These young people are part of a growing group apparently of young people known as NEETs. That means they are young people who are not in employment, education or training. They are often from a disadvantaged background, and many of them have problems with literacy, meaning that they struggle to read and write. Now, as I said, it was on a military base, but the goal of this project wasn't to train soldiers. But the project tried to equip these young people with a certain number of skills to help them, for example, become more employable, to also boost their sense of self-esteem, their self-confidence, and to give them a sense of discipline. The project worked in 3 main areas. I'll give you the 3 main areas before I go into detail on each one. So first of all, first aid and safety at work. FASW, First Aid and Safety at Work, then driving lessons, and the third area was sport. So on First Aid and Safety at Work, the young people learned first aid skills, so how to help someone who is injured, someone who has fallen over. This is obviously a very useful life skill, so to help someone who's had an accident in the street, but it's also very useful for the workplace. Especially in France, the French Labour Code requires at least one person on staff to have first aid training. And obviously, if the young person has received this training before being recruited, that's much better for the employer because the employer doesn't have to pay for it. The trainees receive 14 to 16 hours of first aid training, and their certificate is valid for a period of 2 years. Now, the second area is driving. In France, like in many other EU countries, learning how to drive is often a very costly affair. It can be very difficult. Maybe you have to take the test a number of times. So having a driving license is a huge asset and makes you more employable, makes you more mobile. Through the project that I visited, the young people receive intensive driving lessons on both the theoretical and the practical tests. They receive a total of 190 hours of training. And then they do a further 200 kilometres of accompanied driving. The organisers say that because many of the participants have problems reading and writing, they wouldn't be able to pass the test the traditional way. So this is a huge asset for these young people. The third area is sport. Now, the idea here isn't to train elite athletes, but it's rather to boost their confidence, to instill them with a sense of discipline through sport. It was also about making sport a pleasurable experience, not a chore. Now, the young people were trained in a number of disciplines, in individual sports like running or swimming, and also in team sports like football and basketball. So they were really able to work on their teamwork, and this also improves their employment prospects because they can transfer this over to the workplace. On the whole, the project has been a huge success. 1,500 young people are trained on this military base every year. Their employment prospects are also increased. 80% of the trainees go on to find full-time employment after doing the program. And even though the aim isn't to train soldiers, around 6% of the young people end up going into the military. For me personally, it was a very nice experience too. It was lovely to see all these young people challenging themselves, pushing themselves. However, it did remind me that perhaps my consec skills were a little bit rusty. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right, this is just the introduction, so don't start interpreting yet. The speech is basically about mathematics, arithmetic, and the things we learn at school and that we forget afterwards. I'm going to mention a few terms. First of all, Fahrenheit and Celsius for temperature measurements. I'll also talk about latitude and longitude. I'll talk about probabilities and compound interest. I'll just use the terms. I won't really be discussing any technical aspects. These are just examples of arithmetical problems. And I might mention subprime mortgages right at the end. That's all for the introduction. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, a while ago, I decided to try out a new recipe. And in a fit of modernity, I decided to look for the recipe on the internet. And on the internet, it was fairly simple, but the temperatures were in Fahrenheit rather than Celsius. Since I live in Europe, my oven works in Celsius, so I had to try and figure out how many degrees Fahrenheit, or rather how many degrees Celsius, I needed to actually program my oven. It was relatively simple. I went on Google and I got the right answer. 300 degrees Fahrenheit is about, 148.88 Celsius, which means that my oven needed to be at around 150, and then I was okay. And then I started feeling very guilty, because you see, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I would have been able to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius in my head without even thinking about it, because that was one of the things I was taught at school back then. It was part of the mathematics or arithmetics class. We had basic problems like kilometers to miles, pounds to kilos, and Fahrenheit to Celsius or Celsius to Fahrenheit. And this was something you were expected to know. And ideally, you were expected to be able to do it in your head, because in those days, well, as you can probably tell, it was a very, very long time ago when I was at school. And it was an ancient time before we even had pocket calculators, let alone smartphones or computers. So a small child was expected to be actually able to make these calculations in their head without writing anything down. And you had to know these things because we had exams, even as small children. And if you wanted to go from one year to the next, you had to pass your exam. And if you wanted to have a good grade, you had to be able to solve these sort of problems quickly. And as an extra encouragement, if you were very, very bad in class, you could actually be hit with a stick, because I went to that kind of school back in those days. Now, of course, none of these things would happen nowadays. There's no way that a child would be expected to carry out these sort of mathematical or arithmetic calculations. But as I said, I used to be able to do this almost without thinking. And I wasn't very good at mathematics. I wasn't very good at anything when I was a child, and I'm still not very good now. But those basic kind of things I used to be able to do. And in fact, I felt so bad about this that I tried to remember the formula for conversion from Fahrenheit to centigrade or Celsius. And after a lot of effort, I was able to bring back the memories through the fog of too many years and too many beers. I actually remembered what I thought was the formula. I tried it, and I found that I got almost exactly the same result as Google, which means that somewhere in my brain, despite having played rugby for 30 years and being beaten on the head several times, I actually still have a few brain cells that are functional. But it made me think about all the other things that I have forgotten. For instance, I do remember what compound interest is, obviously, but I can't calculate it anymore. I would have to go on Google. I do remember that there's a relationship between distance and latitude and longitude, and there's another relationship between time and distance and latitude and longitude, but I don't remember the equations anymore. And again, this is something I used to know when I was a small child. And I think that's a pity in a way, because while latitude and longitude may not be immensely useful, knowing the difference between centigrade and Celsius and Fahrenheit, being able to calculate it, is quite useful if you can do it without having to get your computer or your smartphone out. And knowing what compound interest is very useful. If you think about the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, people got into debt because of subprime mortgages, because they borrowed money without understanding how much they would have to pay to repay their debt, without understanding whether the mortgages were affordable or not on their salary, because they didn't understand what interest rates were, let alone what compound interest was. These are basic things that need to be taught at school. The trouble is, even if you taught these things at school, as I've just said, you tend to forget it. So I suppose teaching them at school again would be a start, but exactly what you do with people's memories, I honestly don't know. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to the subject that I'm going to be talking about in this speech, which is designed to be interpreted consecutively. I'm going to be talking to you about how rich people can hide away their fortunes in Swiss banks, and how this prevents this money being used for for better purposes. We'll put it like that. So, if you're ready, I will begin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be able to join you from Geneva to take part in this conference this morning. The task that I have been given is to disprove the theory that Switzerland, with all its neutrality and direct democracy, is a perfect place to live and a country of impeccable morals. Now that promises to be a tall order, given the fact that I've only been allowed 5 or 6 minutes speaking time, and especially when one considers that many of the cliches that one hears about Switzerland are in fact quite true. It is true that the public services in Switzerland are extremely efficient and of high quality. The trains here run like clockwork, and what's more, everywhere is indeed clean and tidy. Much of the country looks like a picture postcard, thanks to the fact that nobody drops litter on the pavements. What's more, Switzerland is one of the richest countries in the world. And within Switzerland, Geneva is one of the richest cities. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is what should make us start to question the morals of this place. You see, Geneva is a city which oozes wealth. We have an elite here that have their own private jets. In fact, I read recently that Geneva Airport has more private jets parked at it than any other airport in the world. And this elite is clad only by the finest designers. Now, you are probably thinking that the elite that I'm referring to are Swiss bankers, but in fact you'd be quite wrong. The elite that I am referring to are actually the bankers' clients. That means to say the multimillionaires and billionaires who are drawn here to Switzerland like iron filings to a magnet by the tax system. You see, unlike many other tax systems, the Swiss system has an element of regressiveness in it. You see, normally what you would expect is that as your level of income increases, so your tax rate would increase. That means to say, if you earn 10,000 francs, then you would pay 10%, but if you earn 50,000 francs, then you would pay 15%. So with these rising proportions, the aim of such a system is to try and redistribute some of that income from the richer people to poorer people, so that those who are less well off can be provided with good public services and social benefits and so on and so forth. However, this isn't the way the Swiss system works. You see, here in Switzerland, the mega rich, those multimillionaires or billionaires that I've been referring to, can opt for paying a fixed amount of tax, which means to say they end up paying a lower rate or smaller proportion of their income than either you or I. Switzerland defends itself by claiming that the presence of these billionaires has, on the one hand, a positive impact on the economy, and any tax revenue that they do pay into the system is a bonus. However, I would argue that for several reasons, the billionaires are being allowed to get away without making a fair contribution. You see, in the meantime, there are many Swiss people who work for a living who find it difficult to get a foot on the property ladder. And looking further afield, whilst these fortunes are being hidden away in Swiss banks, they're not helping the people in other countries where often the fortunes come from. So the money, these fortunes, could be used for much nobler purposes, such as alleviating poverty back home. In fact, my old friend Pepe Mujica, the former president of Uruguay, suggested that were the richest people in the world forced to pay a fair amount of tax, that would generate enough resources to solve world hunger and ensure that everybody has a roof over their heads. So, by way of conclusion, it is true that Switzerland is a lovely place to live, but it's far from being a perfect country, since there's no amount of development aid that can be given that will compensate for the inequalities which are being fostered by Switzerland's tax system. Now, that may seem a rather harsh conclusion, but I would like to see the day when billionaires pay their fair share. Thank you very much.
Hello. The title of this consecutive speech is Sunspots and Climate. I'm going to start my speech now. Ladies and gentlemen, in my younger days, I was a CB radio enthusiast. CB is Citizens Band, of course, and I was also interested in shortwave radio, which is pretty similar in some ways. Now, my interest in CB radio and shortwave radio allowed me to gain snippets of information about, among other things, the sun, and in particular, the solar cycle. I want to talk for a few minutes about the solar cycle and describe its consequences for our lives on Earth. It's all about solar activity. Now, solar activity usually manifests itself as the number of sunspots on the surface of the sun. And this activity occurs in a cycle which lasts about 11 years. So you move from a maximum number of sunspots to a minimum number of sunspots and back to a maximum. That cycle takes about 11 years. The last minimum was about 2006, 2007. The most recent maximum was probably around the end of 2013. Now, the problem with this most recent maximum is that astronomers have found very little activity on the surface of the sun. There are not nearly as many sunspots as usual. In other words, the sun is just not producing the goods. Let me just say a few words about sunspots. Sunspots, as you may know, are darker areas on the surface of the sun. Some of them are as big as the Earth. They usually last a few days, and in fact, they are cooler than the surrounding parts of the sun. Sunspots are about 4,000 degrees Celsius compared to the rest of the surface of the sun, which is at a temperature of about 5,500 degrees Celsius. In fact, sunspots are an indication of a certain amount of disturbance in the sun's magnetic field. Now, as I said, they seem to be somewhat of an endangered species recently because the cycle hasn't really got off the ground. Some people feel that the rhythm of the 11-year cycle is becoming unhitched, and there is other evidence to support this. At this point, you may ask, so what? I mean, what interest is that to me, what happens on the surface of the sun? Well, solar activity does affect our activities here on Earth. First of all, a high level of solar activity improves the propagation of radio waves over long distances. It improves the way shortwave radio can communicate, and the same applies to Citizens Band radio, so that's good news for radio enthusiasts. But that's not the main point. The fact is that the sun's activity also affects the climate. Now, here there's been a lot of speculation, but a certain number of facts have been established. It appears, for example, that a low level of sunspot activity has a significant cooling effect on the Earth's climate. And there is a historical precedent for this, and that's what's known as the Maunder minimum. Now, the Maunder minimum is in fact a period of time, ranging from about 1645 to 1715, so a long time ago. During this period, there was almost no sunspot activity, so the cycle was more or less flat. And especially in Europe, the result was very long winters and very cool summers. So does that mean that with the flattening off of the solar cycle, we're looking at the end of climate change or global warming? Well, scientists wouldn't go this far. They tend to remain rather coy. They point out, first of all, that it's not really possible to predict how long this solar anemia, if you like, might last. It might last for a couple of cycles. It could last for 100 years or more. Nobody really knows. But I think for the environmental alarmists in any case, a longer period of solar inactivity could only be good news, in that it might at least help to offset some of the expected global warming. And of course, for shortwave radio enthusiasts and for CB radio enthusiasts, in other words, the few that remain, because in these days of omnipresent internet and satellite communication, there are very few shortwave radio listeners left anymore. Obviously for those it's quite bad news, because it means that for them the airwaves may be faced with a somewhat longer period of silence. Thank you. Hello. This will be a consecutive speech. The title of this speech is Robbery as a Sideline. How to supplement your income by robbing banks. Okay? I'm going to start my speech now. Ladies and gentlemen, whether or not you currently have a job or are still studying, the fact remains that times are hard. Prices are still rising, despite what they say. Food and drink is becoming more expensive. Living costs generally. Our wages are not keeping up. Sometimes our wages are being cut. And many of us feel the need to seek out additional forms of revenue. Some kind of a part-time job, perhaps. Our own bailout, our own personal rescue package, if you will. Some of us might be tempted to play the stock markets. Others might explore their talents as a writer, a musician. They might dream of Hollywood. However, for your more immediate needs, I'd like to explore one possibility, and that is bank robbery. Let me stress straight away that this is not a recommendation. As a law-abiding citizen, far be it from me to incite anyone to engage in illegal activity. And here, the sad fact is that, quite apart from the ethical considerations, robbing banks is much less lucrative than you might think. And this fact has been borne out recently by a study carried out by the universities of Sussex and Surrey. What they did is they got hold of some data from the British Bankers Association, which allowed them to quantify the rather precarious financial situation of the average bank robber. So let me give you some figures. In the United Kingdom, the average robbery brings in about €25,000. However, in 1/3 of all attempts, the total take is 0. And of course, you've got to remember that each operation involves several co-workers. So the per capita take is even less. In fact, it's well below the minimum wage. And in the United States, they're even more poorly paid. The average take there is only €3,500. And in neither of these cases have I taken account of professional expenses or overheads, such as masks, guns, getaway cars. Now, part of the blame for the poor revenue situation lies with the bank robbers themselves. The authors of the study were astounded in particular by the lack of professionalism of the practitioners, which expresses itself in 3 ways. 3 occupational errors, if you like. First of all, a poor choice of target. They give very little consideration to the size of the financial establishment they intend to visit. Secondly, they don't take account of the proximity of the nearest police station. Thirdly, they pay scant regard to the security system in place in the bank. In fact, it would seem that the choice of target in most cases is pretty arbitrary. And yet things could be different. There is hope. There are ways of improving things. The study of econometrics tells us this. Econometrics involves basically using maths and statistics to solve problems of this type. And there are two main ways in which the situation could be improved. First of all, a better division of labour. Having several gang members is a surefire way of increasing the takings. Although, of course, the price for this increased reliability is that there are more people to share out the takings among. Secondly, it's important to make sound investments. Purchasing a firearm is, statistically speaking, worthwhile. The presentation of a gun at a bank counter raises the take per raid by about €12,700. However, the problem is, and this is a dilemma for the profession, to make it big in this profession, you inevitably have to exercise it more frequently. And that brings me to the risk factor, because on average, 4 robberies tend to be followed by a stint in the cooler. Now, it seems that in many cases, the criminals have come to this realization, which is why robbing banks is in fact no longer the modern criminal's activity of choice. So what do we conclude from all of this? I was going to say that honesty is the best policy, but I think that would be criminally naive, especially in the light of recent events in the world of finance. I've been talking here about members of the public stealing money from banks. But now that we're witnessing massive bailouts in favour of private banks, bailouts involving public money, my conclusion has to take the form of a question. Who's robbing whom? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to talk to you about an event that is celebrated in the United States and the United Kingdom that is known as Small Business Saturday. Now, this might not be something that you've heard of before. As I said, it's only celebrated in 2 countries as far as I know. Please do inform me if anybody knows of another country where it is recognised. And it was only started relatively recently. Small Business Saturday was actually started in 2010, and I was quite surprised to find out that it was started by American Express. And the aim of Small Business Saturday is to support, inspire and promote small businesses, so to bring more custom and therefore more revenue to small businesses. We all know that during recent recessions there are many, many high streets where all of the shops are closing down. And we know that a town with lots of local businesses actually has a very different feel to one that is just filled with big high street chains. So the aim behind Small Business Saturday is to encourage people to shop in small businesses and to ensure that small businesses are able to survive any economic difficulties. So let me just give you a bit of information about how it started in the United States, and then I'll talk a bit about some facts and figures of Small Business Saturday in the UK. So, as I said, it started in the US, and as I'm sure you know, in the United States, Thanksgiving is celebrated on the last Thursday of November. The day after Thanksgiving has become known as Black Friday, and this marks the start of the Christmas shopping season. And I'm sure you'll all have seen on television these scenes of huge crowds of people queuing up to get the best bargains in shops the minute the doors open. So there are huge lines of people and then stampedes the minute the doors are opened, which even results in injuries every year. Now, Black Friday tends to benefit the large retailers because these are the companies that are able to offer huge discounts to people who are looking for the perfect Christmas present and who want to do it cheaply. So the idea that American Express came up with was to set up a small business Saturday that would encourage shoppers to go to do their Christmas shopping in what's called brick and mortar shops. So this means real physical shops and not online. And also to encourage them to go to small, independent, local businesses rather than large chains. When Small Business Saturday was launched, it was promoted widely by American Express through TV and radio advertising campaigns. And American Express also bought advertising space on Facebook, which it then basically donated to its account holders who own small businesses for them to be able to promote and advertise their business on social media, online, in a way that they perhaps couldn't afford to do on their own. And so there's this Small Business Saturday is a kind of awareness campaign to try to simply encourage people to go to these small businesses. Now, let me give you a bit of an idea about how it works in the UK. In the UK, it's a similar idea that people are encouraged to shop in small businesses, but in the UK, it's not connected to any bank or financial provider, but it's a not-for-profit grassroots campaign. So people in the United Kingdom saw how Small Business Saturday was a positive thing for small businesses in the United States and decided to introduce a similar idea in the United Kingdom. And every year, it's the number of people shopping in small businesses on Small Business Saturday is growing. I think I forgot to mention that in the United Kingdom it was introduced in 2013, so 3 years after it started in the United States. The campaign is supported by 75% of the country's towns and cities. So, for example, the council might offer free parking on Small Business Saturday to encourage people to come into the town and shop there, rather than going to a large shopping centre or shopping out of town. To give you an idea of the amount of revenue this generates for small businesses, on last year's Small Business Saturday, over 15 million people shopped in small businesses, and they spent £623 billion on that one day alone. And this is a 24% increase on 2014. 2014's Small Business Saturday also showed a 20% increase on the previous year. So every year it seems to be getting more popular and producing more revenue for small businesses. So let's hope that this trend continues. To sum up, this year's Small Business Saturday will be celebrated in the United States on the 26th of November and in the UK on the 3rd of December. So I hope that you will also in some way get involved in the movement, either by sharing information on Small Business Saturday on social media. You could perhaps share a photo of yourself shopping in a small business. And of course, the biggest thing you can do is to shop in a small business yourself. Not only on Small Business Saturday, but you can try to do this throughout the year to support the little guys in business rather than just the big chains. And if, of course, you don't live in the United States or the United Kingdom, perhaps, if you're very brave, you might even think about getting involved in setting up a small business Saturday in your own country. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to talk to you about private debt in the United Kingdom. According to a recent study that was conducted in the country, the average Briton will be 69 by the time they reach their debt-free birthday. Now, the debt-free birthday is the time when somebody reaches a stage where they've finished paying back their mortgage and they've cleared themselves of all arrears. And the results of this study show that the debt-free birthday is actually 12 years later than what was originally expected. The situation is even more serious for young people who are still at university. The debt-free birthday for those currently at university would be around 74 years old, whereas for those at university in London, it would be 77, and that is due to higher house prices. Now, why has the debt-free holiday age increased? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, is that people are buying houses at a later stage or when they're older, and also mortgage affordability or cheap mortgages means that when people do eventually buy their house, they're actually paying more for it. The second reason that the debt-free holiday age has increased is because people are entering into higher levels of unsecured debt than before. And it's particularly true for young people under the age of 25 years old. That means that young people are using their credit cards more or using payday loans, which are very expensive forms of debt because they are associated with high interest rates. To compound this situation, very often people are unaware that they can actually consolidate these small, expensive loans into a single cheaper loan, which has lower repayments. And that means that with this larger or this higher level of unsecured debt from a young age, by the time people enter into or arrive at wanting to buy a house, then they are still lumbered with this unsecured debt, and then they add a mortgage on top, which means that they are servicing a larger amount of debt for longer. Now, you may ask yourself, does it really matter? Well, for two reasons it really does. First of all, it's because it means that people will be entering retirement still shouldering this large amount of debt. And this obviously is in contradiction with the idea that most people have of a carefree retirement. Secondly, it's also dangerous for the economy because it means that there are many people who are exposing themselves to a sudden hike in interest rates. If there is a sudden hike in interest rates, then this could lead to another debt crisis where the number of people defaulting on a loan will increase. What can we do, therefore, in order to ensure that the situation doesn't get out of control? Well, here, allow me to give you my opinion. First of all, I think it's incumbent on lenders to sell credit responsibly, not only in their own interest, but in terms of corporate social responsibility for the long-term health of the economy, in order to avoid a new bad debt crisis. I think also it would be necessary to educate people at an early stage in order to enter into debt in a more informed way. For example, understanding the ramifications of taking on short-term payday loans, for example, or introducing more solutions to ensure that they can clear themselves of debt more quickly, for example, by consolidation into a cheaper loan. And finally, I do think that perhaps the government should take a role in ensuring that lending is done responsibly and that people are given the choice or given the opportunity to make informed decisions about entering into debt. Thank you very much.
I'll talk to you about Nigeria's claim for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Good morning. The United Nations was created at the end of the Second World War in 1945. Unsurprisingly, one of the tasks that it was given was to ensure international peace and security, with the Security Council having been established for that particular purpose. When the Security Council was set up, 5 permanent seats on it were given to what were, broadly speaking, the 5 victorious powers in the Second World War: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Those are the countries which hold the real decision-making power in the Security Council because they have a veto. Now, there have been many calls for a reform of the Security Council. Firstly, because it's thought that the permanent members no longer represent the balance of power in the world. And secondly, because the veto power often hinders the Security Council from taking action. What is striking is that there are no African members, permanent members of the Security Council. Of course, there was a good reason for that at the time the United Nations was founded. There were only 3 independent nations in Africa, but now there are 54. So Africa should be represented. And the case that I would like to make is that a permanent seat should be given to Nigeria. The reason why I say this is because Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, with a population of some 160 million and constantly growing. It has, unless I'm much mistaken, also got the largest economy in Africa. But above all, I think the main reason why Nigeria should be given a permanent seat on the Security Council is because it has been, over the years, the greatest contributor to the stabilisation of its own sub-region, West Africa. In fact, we can trace Nigeria's role as peacemaker back to the 1990s at least, when it was the leading player in the West African peacekeeping forces, which brokered peace agreements, undertook disarmament programs, and helped organise elections in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Now, these were processes which brought an end to some of the most vicious and cruelest civil wars that the world has known. Much more recently, in 2016, Nigeria was also instrumental in making sure that the Gambian dictator, Jammeh, recognised the presidential election results which attributed victory to his rival, Adama Barrow. This enabled the first peaceful transition of power in the Gambia since the country achieved its independence from Great Britain in 1965. So Nigeria, a country which is often tarnished with an image of corruption and crime, is proving itself to be a force of good in West Africa. It has shown that the formula of African solutions to African problems is a good one, and thus that is why Nigeria's voice should be heard on the Security Council. Its role of peacemaker should now be recognised by giving the country the appropriate status within the United Nations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello. Today I'm going to give you a speech. It's a consecutive speech on a particular dietary practice called raw foodism, where people only eat raw food. There isn't much technical vocab. I mention vegans, vegetarians, and one maybe difficult one, which is a fruitarian, a vegetarian who only eats fruit, basically. And if you're ready, I'll start now. Ladies and gentlemen, nowadays, people seem to be paying quite a lot of attention to both their diet and their impact on the environment. Two things that most people really didn't think about only a few short decades ago. It's becoming more and more common for people to decide to go vegetarian or vegan, not just for their own health, but for the planet's health as well. Some people find this rather extreme, and others say that it's completely ridiculous. Although people like that are part of a diminishing minority at this point, I think. I believe that at this stage, the majority of people understand that changing your diet can have an impact on the environment. That is, if enough people do it. Still, some people find it quite strange. And some people would find it quite difficult as well, myself included, I must admit. While I absolutely agree that we should all try to be as environmentally friendly as we can be, I'm also very aware of how difficult this can be. I'll be the first to admit that I would sorely miss meat if I went vegetarian or vegan. Meat is, after all, delicious. It's also relatively cheap and quite versatile. There seems to be an endless amount of possibilities when it comes to cooking meat. My vegetarian friends, on the other hand, have told me that it's only quite recently that vegetarian and vegan options in restaurants and cafes are becoming more diverse. Although, in the last few years, the amount of choice available to vegetarians and vegans seems to be quickly catching up with the so-called traditional diet. Be that as it may, I have a lot of respect for people who make the conscientious decision to go vegetarian or vegan, because they are choosing to make their lives more difficult in order to help the planet, even if it is somewhat less difficult now than in the past. But some people try to push the envelope even further. It seems like for some people this is actually a competition. They want to see how much they can inconvenience themselves. Take the example of raw foodism, also known as rawism. This is a particular diet that I heard about recently where people only eat uncooked and unprocessed food. The diet is mainly based on fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and some dairy products. You can also eat fish and meat, but only if they're unprocessed and cooked in certain ways. But this depends on your own personal brand of raw foodism. There are two main branches of raw foodism: raw veganism and a raw animal diet. We'll start with raw veganism. A raw vegan diet consists of unprocessed, raw, plant-based food that is not heated above 50 degrees Celsius. So it's mainly based on fruits and vegetables. There are even some extreme subgroups of this, like fruitarians, people who will only eat fruit. Next, there is the raw animal food diet. This includes all the food that a practitioner of raw veganism can eat, as well as any animal products that can be eaten raw, such as eggs, certain muscle meats, organ meats, and some raw dairy products. For anyone who has a weaker constitution, don't worry, I'm not going into the detail of eating raw meats and raw eggs. Instead, I'm going to focus on some of the perceived benefits of raw foodism and the definite drawbacks as well. Proponents of raw foodism say that it's the most natural diet that a human can have. They claim that our ancient ancestors survived on a very similar diet for millennia before we discovered fire. Researchers, however, have discovered evidence of humans cooking food up to 1.8 million years ago. And in the intervening time, we have evolved quite a bit, meaning that a raw food diet is no longer suitable for us. Thanks to evolution, everything from the size of our teeth to the way our digestive system works have changed, making it more and more difficult, if not even dangerous, for us to only eat raw food. Still, those who follow a raw food diet argue that cooking food above a certain temperature can destroy enzymes which help in digestion. They say that certain vitamins and nutrients are also lost during the cooking process. And they argue that cooked foods can contain harmful substances such as fatty acids and carcinogens. But is there any truth to these claims? The short answer is no, or at best, not really. researchers have shown that a raw food diet can actually impair the development of children as they lack certain essentials like vitamins and calories. Studies have also linked a raw food diet with serious weight loss and, of course, unsurprisingly, with food poisoning, which is the main risk associated with a raw food diet. So, while people who practice raw foodism may have the best of intentions for their own health and the planet's health, I think we can all agree that there are much better diets to follow. If you feel particularly strongly about this, going vegan or vegetarian is in itself quite a big step and does make a difference. Even just cutting down on meat and dairy consumption can be of benefit to your health and the planet's health. After all, everyone does need to do their bit, but it's not a competition. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sarah Bedson and I am a trainee at DG SCIC. Today I would like to talk to you about plant milk, and I'll start my speech now. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that every day is now a dedicated World Day for something. Obviously you have those that are more officially recognised, but then there's a vast range of World Days that seem, let's say, less serious. For example, I don't know about you, but I'm not too bothered about remembering when World Nutella Day is. With a quick Google search, I found out that this week we have World Say Something Nice Day and World Insect Repellent Awareness Day, whatever that is. Well, I've got another date for your diaries. You, like myself, were probably blissfully unaware that yesterday, the 1st of June, marked World Plant Milk Day. But I'd like to take this opportunity to talk to you about plant milk, and I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you should perhaps switch to, or at least try, plant milk. Plant milk has been consumed for centuries in various cultures, both as a regular drink, such as the Spanish horchata, and as a substitute for dairy milk. The most popular varieties include soy milk, coconut milk, almond milk, and rice milk. In my experience, plant milks are now readily available in supermarkets all around the world. The first reason why you should drink plant milk is that it's better for the planet. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. By switching from dairy milk to a plant-based milk, you can decrease your carbon footprint, as the plant varieties create up to 80% less carbon emissions. My second reason to drink plant milk is that it's better for the animals. Just like human beings, cows make milk for their offspring. In order for people to drink cow's milk, baby cows are taken away from their mothers. Male calves are then often killed at just a few days old. Choosing plant-based milks, therefore, means that you can help to end the suffering of millions of cows and their calves each year. Now, if you're not convinced about saving the planet or saving the animals, then maybe you consider saving yourself. Plant-based milk is better for you. More and more research is debunking the myth that humans need cow's milk. The dairy industry has long promoted the idea that milk is essential for healthy bones. The statistics, however, do not back this up. The countries with the highest dairy intake are also the ones with the highest levels of osteoporosis. You don't need cow's milk for calcium either. Good plant-based sources include broccoli, kale, figs, Brazil nuts, almonds, and sesame seeds. My fourth reason to drink plant milk is that it's better for your wallet. It's cheap. Plant-based milk also has the added advantage that you can make it yourself. And it's so easy. If you want to make rice milk, for example, you simply soak the rice in water overnight and then you put it in a blender with water. Then you can add sweetener and vanilla extract to taste. My final reason to drink plant milk is a simple one. It's delicious. If you'd like to find out more, then you can search worldplantmilkday.com. In conclusion, with all of the different types of plant milk out there, there's bound to be one for you. So why not give it a try? Thank you.
Hello there. Today I'll be talking about breastfeeding, or if you like, mother's milk. And I'm going to start my speech now. Imagine if scientists were to discover a drug which could reduce infant mortality around the world by, let's say, 15%. And imagine further that this drug would also make your infant more intelligent. And at the same time, as your child grew up, the drug would dramatically reduce the likelihood of your child developing heart disease, or diabetes, asthma, or obesity. And then finally, if you will, imagine that this wonder drug was available free of charge. Well, actually, this drug, and it's not a drug, already exists. It's called breast milk, or mother's milk. And yet, breastfeeding is not popular today, neither in the so-called developed world, nor in developing countries. In the West, women who breastfeed their babies are often seen as rather peculiar or a bit alternative. In the developing world, of course, the problem is the multinational corporations who persuade mothers that their own natural milk is not as good as the product that the corporations can offer, the baby formulae. But in fact, breastfeeding is simply the best thing that a mother can do for her baby, and it's also beneficial to the mother herself. If a mother does breastfeed her child, that can significantly reduce the mother's risk of osteoporosis or even cancer. And yet, as I say, breastfeeding is frowned upon. If we take the country where I come from, Britain, it has the worst record in the developed world, second only to Belgium, in fact, as far as breastfeeding goes. Some 24% of British babies never taste breast milk at all. And by 6 months, a majority of them have shifted entirely to baby formula. Why is this? Why are we neglecting baby's health and mother's health in this way? Well, some people say that breastfeeding is actually physically difficult for many women, even impossible. That is simply not true. The WHO puts the number of women who have physical problems with breastfeeding as less than 1%. Other people argue that nowadays women prefer the so-called liberation of the bottle. It makes them freer. Well, in the UK, the Department of Health actually asked women about this. They carried out a survey, and it turns out that 90% of mothers who stopped breastfeeding at 6 weeks said that they would have liked to carry on. And 40% of those who stopped at 6 months said the same. In fact, the biggest reason given by most women for stopping breastfeeding and putting their baby on the bottle is their need to return to work. So what can be done about that? Well, for an answer to that question, we might look at the country where breastfeeding rates are extremely high, probably the highest in the world, still at 90% at 6 months. And that country is Norway. What do the Norwegians do? Well, they give their mothers a year off work on 80% pay. And when state employees return to work, they are allowed breastfeeding breaks. Of course, this costs some money up front, But the Norwegians say that it saves much more money further down the line. Because in the end, what do you end up with? You end up with a more intelligent, a healthier workforce that pays more tax and that puts less pressure on the health service. And it has been estimated that if British babies, for example, were breastfed at Norwegian rates for just 3 months, that could save the National Health Service hundreds of millions of pounds a year. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be talking today about life expectancy, and I'll be looking at some of the most significant causes of death around the world and some of the risk factors contributing to those causes. People are living longer than they did 40 years ago, quite dramatically so, in fact. Life expectancy for men has gone up by 11 years since 1970, and for women, the figure is even higher. It's 12 years. That's the good news to emerge from a study of the world's health, the biggest study of its kind ever carried out, and the study has just been completed. I'll say more about it in a moment. But the bad news that has emerged from the same study is that with increased longevity come increased mental and physical health problems. So I want to look briefly at the findings of this study. As I say, it was the biggest such study ever conducted. It was carried out over a period of more than 5 years, involving over 500 researchers around the world in countries like the US, many European countries, but also Japan, China, and countries in Latin America. And I want in particular to look at the main causes of death which were identified in the study, and more particularly at the significant risk factors which lead to the problems from which people are dying. Let me start by throwing another figure at you. I don't know if you knew this, but around the world each year some 50 million people die. 50 million people every year. What are we dying from, apart from old age and natural causes? Well, the study I've been referring to points out that the number one cause of death around the world is now heart disease and stroke. Heart disease and stroke were responsible for 12.9 million deaths in 2012. That's about a quarter of the total number of deaths worldwide. What about the risk factors leading to heart disease and stroke? Well, the study puts high blood pressure at the very top of the list. High blood pressure was responsible for 9.4 million deaths per year. And high blood pressure, of course, can be caused by various things. It can be caused, or certainly made worse, by poor diet, for example. People eating too much salt. That can lead to high blood pressure. It also seems from the study that some people in certain countries have what you might call a genetic predisposition to high blood pressure. This is the case apparently in India. In Europe and in North America, lots of people, of course, take pills in order to try to bring their blood pressure down because they know that high blood pressure is a significant risk factor for strokes. And as I say, strokes and heart disease is, according to this study, the number one cause of death around the world. Next on the list of risk factors comes smoking. You probably won't be surprised to hear that. Smoking leads to 6.3 million deaths around the world each year. And by smoking, I mean both active and passive smoking. Then we have alcohol. Alcohol led to 5 million deaths in 2012. Drinking can cause, as we know, liver cancer or cirrhosis of the liver. But it also plays a significant role in other diseases, things like cancer of the esophagus, for example. And of course, when people drink too much, they may end up being involved in some kind of violent incident or in an accident, which can be another significant cause of death. So alcohol is a significant risk factor worldwide, leading to 5 million deaths. And then finally, the study talks about diet and exercise, or rather poor diet and lack of exercise, lack of physical activity. These two combined were responsible for 4.8 million deaths in 2012, according to the study. So the message is clear. If we want to live longer, but also live more healthily, then we need to watch our blood pressure. We need to eat less salt. We need to stop smoking if we are smokers. We need to limit the amount of alcohol we drink, and we need to take more exercise. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joe, and I'm going to give you a speech today about hippos. And I'm going to mention one name that you might have heard before, Pablo Escobar. So, if you're ready, we'll begin. Ladies and gentlemen, as you probably know, hippos come from Africa. But you can now find hippos in the wild in another continent very far away from the hippos' homeland in Africa. Nowadays, you can find hippos living in the wild in Colombia. Yes, Colombia. Believe it or not, it's true. How did these hippos get to Colombia? Did they swim across the Atlantic? Well, no, of course not. They can't do that. These hippos were brought from Africa to Colombia by the notorious drug lord Pablo Escobar. He brought across one group of 4 or 5 hippos, and the idea was that he wanted to include them in his zoo. Pablo Escobar had a private zoo in order to impress the local population. People could go and visit the zoo free of charge, and for many poor Colombians, it was the only opportunity in their entire lives to see animals that come from faraway lands. So Pablo Escobar managed to gain a lot of popularity thanks to this zoo. You could visit there not only hippos, you could see giraffes, you could see penguins, flamingos. You could even see the plane that Pablo Escobar used to smuggle drugs into the United States. Yep, he wasn't hiding it. So the zoo helped Pablo Escobar to become very popular, but he was actually guilty of ruining the lives of many Colombians as a result of his criminal activities. Huge numbers of Colombians were killed as a result of the violence wreaked in the country because of Pablo Escobar's involvement in the drug trade. Despite all of this, he remained popular thanks to his zoo and other measures. He also built houses for poor people as well, for example. Pablo Escobar's empire was not to last, unfortunately. Well, unfortunately, depending on how you see things. Like many other criminals, the authorities caught up with him in the end, and in 1991, he was arrested and put in prison. Despite being locked away, he was still able to control large shares of the drugs market, and his criminal exploits continued even while he was behind bars. But in 1993, Pablo Escobar's story came to a dramatic end when he was shot dead. Pablo Escobar's empire came to an end, but there is one important part of his legacy which lives on nowadays, and that is because when Pablo Escobar died, his premises, his home, was left unguarded, and the hippos that were on the zoo managed to swim out of the enclosure into the rivers and lakes around, and they then lived in the wild and thrived. They were very comfortable in this environment. It was The temperatures were perfect, the surroundings were exactly what hippos like. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to go and see a hippo in the wild, you don't have to go to Africa. You can actually go and practice your Spanish in Colombia as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Helen Campbell. I'm a retiree of the European Commission and SCIC. And I'm going to talk to you now about a hamster cull in Hong Kong. And I'm going to start now. My favourite newspaper is the Financial Times, which I try to read every day. The front page is usually about financial matters, as you might expect, but also, quite often, if there is a major story of general interest, that will make the headlines. Now, back in January, mid-January of this year, 2022, on the front page was a photograph of a small animal in a carry-on bag. It was a little hamster, and it had been rescued by volunteers. The volunteers wanted to stop the owner handing over the hamster to the authorities in Hong Kong. What was behind this? What was the story? Well, a decision had just been taken by the government of Hong Kong to cull, in other words kill, some 1,000 hamsters and other small animals, because it was feared that they might be spreading the COVID-19 virus. As well as killing the animals, the government had decided to place a quarantine over 150 pet shops, in other words, making them officially close down. Now, in Hong Kong, but almost everywhere else one can think of, people have pets, and they tend to love their pets. And so, in the case of Hong Kong, there were thousands of people with pets signing petitions, and lawyers were urging people not to hand over their four-legged friends to the state, because we can imagine what fate those animals would meet. Hong Kongers are not allowed to demonstrate on the streets, but they can act, and they did and do. There were petitions organised, and then many people tried very hard to leave Hong Kong with their pet. The trouble was that there were very few commercial flights available. The freight service was limited, and a lot of crew members were off sick. The situation is a little better now, but still not great. So the only option for pet owners was to charter a private plane at the cost of $25,700. That is per person with a pet. And there was huge demand in January. Many people wanted to fly out and to return home with their pets, including cats and dogs and rabbits as well as hamsters. But it does cost a lot of money to hire a private jet. In Hong Kong, somebody dreamt up the idea of jet pooling. And so a number of people would get together, hire the jet, and then could get out with their pets. One pet shop owner said that before the pandemic, his business was fairly even, 50-50 importing and exporting animals. But now it's around 95% of exports. It can be very expensive indeed for larger pets. They may be part of a family, and the family is very attached to their animal, And so people are naturally very worried about this movement. One company has arranged 11 private jets in the matter of 2 weeks and 7 more the week after, all for pet location. Flights are mostly to the UK, to Canada, Taiwan and Singapore. And there are more relocation flights planned for this year. I particularly loved the photograph in the paper of a beautiful pedigree German Shepherd dog sitting on a luxury seat on a private plane. The dog's name was Caviar, and the owner had been desperate to take Caviar out of the country and had waited to get on a flight, but finally decided that a private plane was the only way that such a sensitive dog could travel. Now, I do love dogs myself, and I very much hope that Caviar has now settled comfortably in wherever he is. Thank you.
Hello, my subject today is going to be Esperanto, and I'll refer to Ludwig Zamenhof and to the city of Białystok. And now I'll begin. Ladies and gentlemen, we often hear that English, or some form of English in any case, is becoming a sort of global language. It's used in business, in the media, and particularly on the internet, as well as in international diplomacy. Not everyone's happy about this, of course. English is associated with economic and military domination by the United States and the Americanization of many of the world's cultures. English was also the language of the British Empire and therefore is viewed as a language of colonialism. So while it may be an international language, it's not necessarily a neutral language. But no language is, for that matter. Over the centuries, different people have attempted to create a universal language that wouldn't carry this type of cultural baggage with it. Esperanto is one of these languages you may be familiar with. Esperanto was the brainchild of Ludwig Zamenhof. Zamenhof was born in Białystok, in what is now Poland, in 1859. At the time of Zamenhof's birth, however, Białystok was under Russian rule. A majority of its population consisted of Jews who spoke Yiddish, like Zamenhof's family. There were also minorities who spoke Polish, Russian, and German. Zamenhof came up with the idea of an international language while he was still at secondary school. He went to university and trained to be a doctor. But even after he began to practice as an ophthalmologist, he continued to work on his new language. He finally published a booklet describing it in 1887. He wrote it under a pseudonym, Dr. Esperanto, and he chose this name because in his new language, Esperanto means hope. Dr. Zamenhof had a modest ambition. He hoped that his creation, this new language, would bring about world peace, because he believed that the world was in fact divided by languages. And this is because, to some extent, while he was growing up in Białystok, he observed tensions among groups of people speaking different languages there. And he thought that if they could all speak a common language, they would have fewer conflicts. Zamenhof felt that the languages that people were already speaking were weighted down with all sorts of associations related to history, to politics, to national identity. He hoped that Esperanto could serve as a neutral language that would allow people to speak to each other simply as fellow human beings. No one would be forced to speak someone else's language to communicate. People would be able to relate to each other without any reference to nationality. and perhaps this would aid them in resolving conflicts and coexisting peacefully. Zamenhof wanted his language to be easy to learn, something that people could master within a few months. Therefore, Esperanto has a very simple grammar. It's completely regular, with no irregular verbs. All the nouns have the same gender. The vocabulary comes from Romance and Germanic languages, and this makes it easy for speakers of European languages to learn. Esperanto grew in popularity throughout the 20th century as more people began to learn the language, many of them because they shared Dr. Zamenhof's philosophy and beliefs. The development of Esperanto has now continued into the 21st century, and the advent of the internet has had a significant impact on the language, as learning it has become increasingly accessible. Esperanto even has its own Wikipedia section with 280,000 articles. It's estimated that about 2 million people worldwide speak Esperanto at some level. The language is currently spoken by people living in more than 100 countries. Now, of course, this number, 2 million, is still very small, and it doesn't seem as though the use of Esperanto is going to bring about world peace anytime soon. It's striking, however, that so many people continue to place their hope in Esperanto. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hannah and I'm a trainee at the Commission. I'm going to talk to you about Facebook, some of the advantages, disadvantages and future possibilities. And I'm going to start my speech now. One of my New Year's resolutions for 2017 was one that perhaps many people have, and that is to check my Facebook account less. I did some research and found some statistics which showed how influential Facebook is in our lives on a worldwide scale. The most shocking statistic which I found was that there are approximately 1.79 billion users of Facebook, which is almost 1 in 4 people on Earth, so 25% of the world's population. So this is undoubtedly the largest network with more users than Twitter and Instagram. And I'm going to talk to you about what I see as the most important advantages, disadvantages, and dangers and possibilities for the future. So let's start with the advantages. For someone who lives abroad, for example, it's a wonderful tool to stay in contact with friends and family and contact anyone, anywhere, at any time, and keep these friendships and relationships virtually. However, with this, and an important factor to bear in mind is that we only gain a snapshot into the lives of Facebook friends who we don't see day to day. What we see on our news feeds is often portrayed in a very positive light, and this can make us compare ourselves to what we see on Facebook. Let me give you an example. So an album of holiday photos may look like the person had a wonderful time. However, this may not necessarily be true. Posting about a new job, a wonderful sounding new job, does not necessarily mean that this person is happy with it. And this leads to the danger of creating a different or potentially a false perception of other people's lives. And in turn, I believe that this can affect our own expectations. It can make us feel like we're underachieving when we compare ourselves to successful peers who we see online. So now I'll talk about the potential power or danger that Facebook can present to us. It's alarming to think that people in the last decade are potentially the first generation to ever have their life documented on this worldwide platform. I often see pictures posted of young children, and I wonder how often do people stop and think what consequences this could have in the future. So let's say in 30 years' time, people or people with the know-how could have the possibility to have access to somebody's entire life, to from the moment they were born to their 10th birthday party or their university life. So imagine if this were you. Someone could know the town where you grew up, they could know the school you went to, information about your family, and that way potentially determine your social background, your religion, your nationality. Despite the argument that we are protected by anonymity, by the huge amount of information available, for example, the fact that on average about 300 million photos are posted every day on Facebook. Despite this information could be used discriminately against us. And this is an important factor to bear in mind. However, all in all, I think it is important to remember the positive current and future uses Facebook could have and use this to shape the way we use Facebook, both personally and collectively. So it's a network, as I've said, that connects 25% of the world's population, and we can use this to educate people, to bring people together, share experiences and cultures. It's a platform that most people are familiar with and have access to, and we can use this to raise global awareness and transmit messages. For example, Facebook has already proved to be very useful in locating missing people, for example, or simple things like finding somewhere new to live in a new city. So the future use is to bring people together on a huge scale. Now, in conclusion, will you stop and think before you upload your next photo? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joe, and I'm going to give you a speech today about grammar and language. Now, you may be familiar with a few of the terms I'm going to use if you've studied languages. I'm going to speak about prescriptive grammar, descriptive grammar, the subjunctive, and I'm going to mention a couple of authors such as David Crystal and Guy Deutscher. So, if you're ready to start, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's safe to say that if you're watching this speech, you probably studied languages at some point in your life. You may be a linguist to some degree yourself. And so you're more than familiar with what grammar is. But just in order to refresh our memories, let's just give a quick definition of grammar. So grammar is a set of rules that gives structure to our language, and we wouldn't be able to communicate without it. We won't be able to communicate without grammar in any language, whether it's a newspaper article in English or whether it's a member of a tribe, two members of a tribe in the Amazon, speaking in a language that has never been written down. Grammar is important in any language. The order of the words we use can completely change the meaning of what we say. So if grammar is so important, maybe we should set a few rules for it. How should we go about doing that? Well, there are two main ways of doing this. You can take the prescriptive approach, where you set a number of fixed rules which have to be abided by, or you can take a descriptive approach, which means that you put together rules on the basis of how people use language. You listen to how people speak and you look at how people write, and it's on that basis that you put together your rules. So if you take the prescriptive approach, then, well, if you want to know what the prescriptive approach is, then maybe you could think back to when you were studying grammar at school. You probably learnt grammar in a prescriptive way at first. Your teacher probably told you that you have to spell words in a certain way and that you need to respect a certain word order. You were probably told that there are rules you have to abide by when using commas and full stops in your writing. If, on the other hand, you prefer to take a prescriptive approach, then you might say that there is no such thing as speaking or writing incorrectly. For example, most rap artists don't stick to the rules of grammar that you would hear about in a primary school classroom. They have their own usage of language, but this usage of language that a rap artist may use, it may be theoretically incorrect, but does that mean that it has no grammar and no meaning? Well, no, of course not. A rap song is packed with meaning. And similarly, a teenager who writes an SMS to their friend, this may not be done with standard spelling, but it very much does pass on a clear meaning to the friend. So these are valid forms of communication, and they do have their own grammar. We could describe those, and that would be the prescriptive approach to grammar. So we're all very much aware of how essential grammar is and how essential language is to our activities as human beings. We need to structure our language so that it makes sense. And experts say that there are two main ways of providing this structure. There are pros and cons to both of them. We need to set rules so that we can understand each other. If you want to be a respected author, then you would want to show your readers that you can use language correctly. If you want to be a translator or an interpreter, you can't just simply invent your own usage of the language. If you're learning a new language, it's useful to be able to look up the rules for how to speak. For example, if you're learning Spanish and you don't know what the subjunctive is, it would probably be much quicker to learn a few rules from a grammar book rather than trying to observe and describe the usage of the subjunctive from all the Spanish speakers around you. But we also need to be flexible, because after all, language changes over time. We cannot simply use the rules that were set by an academic many years ago. And in fact, language is actually created as a result of all the little mutations and changes that take place in day-to-day speech and in writing. I don't have time to go into the details here, but if you study linguistics, then you'll discover that many of the words and structures we use in language nowadays come from people making mistakes with language in the past. I'd love to tell you a great deal more about this topic. I'm very passionate about it, and I studied it at university. I could speak for ages about this, but sadly there's no time today. So I'd just like to wrap up by recommending that you read David Crystal and Guy Deutscher. These are two experts in this field, and their books are very easy to read, very interesting, very entertaining, and this is above all for someone like you who is a linguist. Thank you.
Good afternoon. By way of an introduction, I should just like to remind you of the date today. It is the 5th of February 2016. That will give you much context, I believe, for the remarks I'm about to make. Also, I'd like to give credit to the author who inspired many of these remarks, and that was Thomas L. Friedman in an article in the New York Times. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to give you a few remarks about the current situation around the world. A few years ago, I had the chance to see a documentary on art history, and the documentary focused on the turn of the century between the 19th and the 20th centuries. It made reference to the fact that the Eiffel Tower had recently been built, that people were beginning to take flights, and that there was the beginning and subsequent reality of the advent of the car. It made me think that perhaps, and most likely, we are experiencing a similar period of revolution or upheaval. Let us look at some of the facts and raise a few questions. A few what-ifs, if you may. For 30-some years now, China has been growing at a steady clip, 2-digit growth, in fact, for the economy. And that has been fueling the world's economy with imports and exports. But recently, that growth has seemed to come to somewhat of a sputtering halt. So what will that mean? What if China's growth does indeed stop, and with it, its ability to fuel the world economy? More facts. A few years ago, we couldn't really get away from the discussion around what would happen when oil prices hit the century mark. But now it seems that we're more focused on the fact that oil is going to be hovering around $30 per barrel. Prices are falling rapidly. And what if they remain low? What will that mean? The fall in these oil prices is in large part due to technological advances, increase in the use of fracking and horizontal drilling in the United States, for example. But that has thrown much of the world economy into somewhat of unknown territory. Meanwhile, and in large part because of this, the Arab system seems to be collapsing. In other words, the structure of Arab countries around the world and the push and pull in the geopolitics of that area of the world. And meanwhile, Iran's isolation is coming to an end. What if all of this changes drastically the way that we are able to function in this new rewritten geopolitical map? And what about the European Union? It seems to be struggling as well with its place in the world and its structure. There's not a day that goes by where we do not discuss the possibility of a Brexit or a Grexit, breakdown of the Schengen area. This is leaving people to wonder what would happen if there was a collapse, and even begin to feel that that collapse could happen at any time. What if the EU were to fall apart? And then there is the issue of the overhaul of two-party political systems in many parts of the world, at least those that were predominantly two-party systems, such as Spain or France, and of course in the US as well, that two-party system seems very much to be reevaluated, with the Tea Party caucus consistently drawing great focus and attention. This brings me to a conclusion of somewhat of an American nature. In fact, all of these issues and all of these what-ifs are things that should be keeping us up at night, wondering what perhaps the world is going to look like in just a few years' time. Meanwhile, the presidential election campaign in the United States is ongoing. It seems that the focus, however, isn't on these very important questions. In fact, at times they're not even addressing them at all. And I think that leads me to my conclusion that of all of these very frightening what-ifs, perhaps the most frightening is, what if the next president of the United States hasn't even begun to contemplate these very important questions for the future and for today? Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to make a speech about persons with disabilities. I'll just give you a few terms. I'll be mentioning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'll be speaking about accessibility, barriers, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I will also be using terms which are considered to be appropriate in this context, such as non-disabled. So I would ask you to pay careful attention to reflect that. Thank you. And now I will begin. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that one of the best known phrases from any international instrument is the phrase that we are all born free and equal, which is something which is included in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948. Yet, even now, over 70 years since the Universal Declaration was adopted, this statement is still far from being true for a large part of humanity. One of the largest communities facing discrimination is that of persons with disabilities, who are estimated to make up around 15% of the world's population. That means to say that almost 1 in every 6 people has a disability, and that persons with disabilities number over 1 billion around the world. Persons with disabilities face discrimination on a number of levels, and I will just mention a few of them here in this speech. But in particular, they face discrimination at the level of accessibility in the form of barriers. There are physical barriers, institutional or structural barriers, and attitudinal barriers which prevent them from taking a full part in our society. To give you an example of the first kind of barrier, physical barriers are often faced by wheelchair users. For example, when they try to get access to a public building, they may find that they can't get in because there is a flight of stairs at the entrance and no ramp. Now, this barrier is not the fault of the wheelchair, rather it is the fault of the design of the building, which hasn't taken these needs into consideration. When it comes to institutional barriers, one cannot help but noticing that children with disabilities cannot access education easily. There are many of them which cannot access education at all, and there are others, the vast majority, who cannot access education on an equal footing with other children. All too often, children with disabilities cannot attend an ordinary school and sit in the same classroom as non-disabled children, even though they have the necessary cognitive capability to do so. Instead, they are segregated into special schools which only children with disabilities attend. When it comes to the world of work, people with disabilities run up against a number of attitudinal barriers, in the sense that all too often employers don't want to hire workers with disabilities because they consider that the adaptation that they'll have to make to the workplace is an additional cost. This kind of adaptation being known as reasonable accommodation. However, when an employee falls sick or goes on maternity leave, these events also entail costs, but provision is made for them through social welfare contributions. So why couldn't the same be done in order to make a provision for reasonable accommodation for workers with disabilities? It's in view of these widespread forms of discrimination at the 3 levels which I've described, and many others which people with disabilities face during the course of their lifetimes, that in 2006 the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, which introduces a new model, a human rights-based approach to disability, and one which considers persons with disabilities as rights holders and equal members of society. Ladies and gentlemen, this convention, this United Nations Convention, enjoys almost universal ratification, with over 170 member states already having signed and ratified it. Let's hope that they honour their obligations and fully implement the convention as quickly as possible, so that we put a stop to this unfair and really quite awful discrimination that persons with disabilities face on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
I would like to make a speech about migration, and more particularly about east-west migration in Europe. I'll refer to the names of 2 species of bird, the swallow and the stork. I will refer to the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. I will refer to the Iron Curtain, to Eastern enlargement of the European Union, and to the phenomenon of social dumping involving lorry drivers. So if you're ready, I will begin shortly after this pause. Ladies and gentlemen, most global migration routes go from the south to the north, from the poor south to the rich north for humans, or from the warm south to the cool north for migratory birds such as the swallow or the stork, which have become symbols of summertime in Europe. On the great land masses of the Northern Hemisphere, Eurasia and North America, there is also a second direction of human migration, driven by the demands of the global economy. This second direction of human migration goes from inland continental regions to regions bordering the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. So in North America, we see young people leaving their homes in the Midwest to seek jobs on the East Coast or in California on the West Coast. And in China, we see people from the interior of the country, which is poorer, seeking employment in the mega cities that have arisen in China's coastal regions. As for Europe, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, we have seen millions of young and not so young Eastern Europeans seeking their fortune in parts of Europe closer to the Atlantic Ocean. The European Union facilitated and amplified this east-west migration by taking in 12 Central and Eastern European countries from 2004 onwards. This is referred to as the Eastern enlargement of the European Union. And it must be said that the legacy of this Eastern enlargement is not exclusively positive, and it calls into question the wisdom and in particular the timing of the political decision to enlarge the European Union to the east. It would seem that the decision to enlarge was sound, but that it was carried out with unseemly haste. So what are the advantages and disadvantages, the positive and negative sides of the legacy of the Eastern enlargement? Well, on the positive side, we now have the largest internal market in the world, which is great news for businesses wishing to sell their goods and services in Europe. But on the negative side, we now have the phenomenon of social dumping in Europe, whereby Western hauliers can now, for example, employ Eastern European lorry drivers at a fraction of the cost of employing Western European drivers, and under much worse working conditions, putting the safety of all of us as road users at risk. Also on the negative side, the sheer scale of East-West migration in Europe has undermined Western European unity. Switzerland and the United Kingdom have both sought to limit the impact of East-West migration by distancing themselves from the European Union to escape from the obligation of having to allow the free movement of Eastern Europeans into their territories. With the benefit of hindsight, one wonders if it was really essential to enlarge the European Union so quickly. What were politicians of the time driven by? If fear of a resurgence of nationalism in Eastern Europe was a factor which influenced their decision, one can only remark that there has been a resurgence of nationalism in Eastern Europe anyway, and that membership of the European Union has not been able to prevent it. But maybe, I suppose one could argue that nationalism can be more easily controlled and channeled into non-destructive forms of expression within the institutional framework of the European Union. Maybe it is easier to keep it under control inside the EU than leaving these countries outside the EU. Well, only time will tell if that turns out to be a valid argument or not. For the time being, both human migration from both south to north and from east to west is bringing more and more people into Western Europe, which creates a dangerous opportunity for the extreme right to garner support. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, I'm going to make a speech now about China and Germany, and I will refer to the Volkswagen car and a model of Volkswagen called the Volkswagen Santana. And there will also be three well-known leaders referred to. So Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, and Angela Merkel. Here we go. Chinese people are no better than Americans at identifying European countries and having a rough idea of where they are on the map of Europe. And this is perhaps excusable because most European countries are relatively small and distant, and their influence on Chinese history has been very limited. The exceptions to this rule are France, Germany, the UK, Spain, and Italy. These countries and their football teams are generally well known in China. And the arrival of the COVID-19 virus in Europe followed the same route as many Chinese tourists follow when they come to Europe to visit France, Germany, the UK, Italy, and Spain. So Germany is one of those well-known European countries in China. It's popular as a tourist destination for Chinese tourists too. And it's also popular among Chinese leaders and businessmen for economic reasons, for business rather than for pleasure, as it were. China is seeking to develop itself economically and is understandably impressed by the consistently strong economic performance of Germany, which defeat in the two world wars of the 20th century has only served to strengthen. Germany is now by far Europe's largest and most successful manufacturing economy, And it's also China's most important trade and technology partner in Europe. The annual volume of trade between the two countries now exceeds $100 billion. And one German company that has been in China for a very long time already is Volkswagen, the car manufacturer. Volkswagen's presence in China dates back to the opening of its Shanghai factory in 1984. And evidence of this is the fact that most of the taxis in Shanghai are Volkswagen Santanas. The other economies of Europe are too small and too service-based to be of much relevance for China to learn from for its own development. So, when Chinese leaders meet their European counterparts, when they meet EU representatives, their focus is Germany, Germany, and Germany. On the German side, Germany has a strong automobile industry lobby which sees the Chinese market as the most important market for the future of this industry. So Germany has a kind of economic approach to relations with China. In any case, its political and military ambitions in outside Europe in general are very limited, and this is a legacy of its defeat in the two world wars, which I referred to earlier. For example, Germany's colonial links to Africa and the Pacific were severed by defeat in the First World War. So German firms are less likely to be in competition with Chinese firms in these regions than British or French firms are, for example. And in the steel sector, Germany and China have developed a kind of symbiotic relationship whereby China produces the largest quantity of crude steel in the world, while Germany produces smaller quantities of refined steel products, many of which are made from Chinese crude steel and which are subsequently re-imported back into China. So it seems there is quite a lot of scope for Germany and China to build a constructive, pragmatic friendship on an economic basis. And this bodes well for the EU-China summit planned during the German presidency of the EU. At this summit, President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang will meet Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. And the Chinese side will be anxious to increase its cooperation with Germany in the manufacturing of vehicles and machinery and so on, while the German side will be anxious to push environmental issues.
Hello, my name's Owen Ward from the English Language Unit, and I have a speech for you. You don't have to start interpreting just yet, don't worry. I'm going to give you an introduction and some useful vocabulary. So my speech is about cults and about the characteristics of cults. I'll give you some general vocabulary, so obviously a cult. Some general religious vocabulary will come up, like Christianity, Judaism, Jesus Christ, Messiah. I talk about the Vietnam War. I also talk about the Civil Rights Movement, which was a reaction to the war in the United States. Indoctrination. I use the verb to prey on. And I also speak about peer pressure. So without further ado, I'll get started. My speech begins now. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that we live in a complex world with a lot of abstract concepts. It can sometimes be difficult to define these concepts. It's also quite tricky sometimes to draw a distinction between two similar concepts. Take the example of language and dialect, for example. There are some people who say that a dialect is, or rather a language, is just a dialect which is backed up by a number of institutions, like an army or a government. The same could be said for religions and cults. There are some scholars who say that a religion is just a cult which has been around for a long time. Some modern religions, like Judaism or Christianity, were considered to be cults at the time when they started out. with the example of Christianity, Jesus Christ was just one of around 12 leaders who claimed to be the Messiah. Now, cults can spring up anywhere around the world, but I think we can say that the United States, with its long history of religious tolerance, is particularly fertile ground for cults. It's hard to say exactly how many cults there are out there, but there's an estimate in the United States that there's anywhere between 2,000 and 5,000 cults, so a huge number, I think we can agree. These cults have often emerged in turbulent times. We can think in particular of the 1960s and 1970s. This was a time when the United States was going through a lot of changes, generational changes, the conflict in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, which sprang up in response to the war, and the rights movements to gain more rights for, say, African Americans. So in this speech, I would like to explore some of the characteristics of a cult, and also talk about how cult members and cult leaders recruit new people into their cult. Now, there are three main characteristics of a cult. First of all, there's usually a charismatic leader at the head of the cult. This is an authority figure who demands respect and claims to be representing God on earth. So the words that come out of his mouth, and I say his because they're usually men, the words that come out of his mouth come directly from God. The second characteristic is indoctrination, or some degree of mind control. As the words from the leader come directly from God, the idea is that if you believe in God and if you believe in the Bible, then you should absolutely believe what the leader tells you and follow their instructions. The third characteristic is that there's a degree of exploitation. Now, this exploitation can take different forms. It can be sexual exploitation, meaning that some of the younger members of the cult, usually young females, have to have sex with the cult leader. It could also be financial exploitation. In some cults, for example, you have to hand over all your money to the cult. Anything that you earn goes to the cult. And then you also need to spend some time recruiting new followers. This is a commitment that you make when you join the cult. So we can see here that there's a degree of manipulation. That is really the key to a cult. It's not based on belief, it's based on manipulation. And this manipulation takes a number of different forms as well. Often cult leaders prey on vulnerable people at a difficult time in their life or an important time in their life. For example, when young people leave home for the first time, if someone loses their job, it means that they're more vulnerable to being manipulated and being recruited for a cult. The second form of manipulation is that the cult leader creates a new reality for the person. They isolate their followers from the outside world and tell them how dangerous the outside world is. They're much safer inside the cult, of course. The third form is that they emphasize the importance of having a good relationship with the leader. You really need to be on the leader's good side. And finally, there's a form of peer pressure. So this means that everyone in the cult believes the same thing, and if you don't believe the same thing, you stand out. We all want to fit in, of course. Now, cults may seem like a throwback to the 1970s, but there are plenty of cults still out there today. There's a lack of a sense of community out there. People don't feel like they belong to society anymore. And that means that cults are once again on the rise, but that they're taking different forms this time. There are many online gurus and cult leaders who post videos on YouTube, for example, trying to influence people and to gain control. And of course, on YouTube, you can just watch one video after another. It's very compulsive, it's very addictive. So that means that people are becoming radicalized. However, there is hope on the horizon. Many people end up leaving cults. There are few reasons for this. The leader doesn't turn out to be what they pretended to be. There's a degree of hypocrisy. They see that the leader or the members say one thing but do the opposite. Or sometimes people have a glimpse of reality. They leave this constructed reality and see the real world and would much rather live in the real world. So in conclusion, I hope you found this speech interesting, and I would just like to give you one tip before I go. Beware of charismatic people coming into your life claiming that they can make everything better. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to talk to you about Bougainville. Ladies and gentlemen, when the French explorer Louis Bougainville gave his name to an island in the Pacific Ocean, he was probably hoping to go down in the annals of history. Yet, I think that relatively few of us have heard of either Bougainville the explorer or Bougainville the island. I certainly didn't even hear about it during the period between 1988 and 1998, when a vicious civil war was being fought on the island that led to the deaths of 10% of its population. However, I did come across Bougainville in some quarters of the British press, that is to say, not the tabloids, in late 2019. The reason why Bougainville had come to the attention of certain British newspapers was because a referendum on its independence was being organised. That referendum was one of the most important points of a peace agreement which was signed in 2001 between the two parties involved in the civil war. On the one hand, the authorities of Papua New Guinea, of which Bougainville is a part, and on the other hand, the Bougainville regional government, representing the pro-independence forces. Now, I mentioned that the civil war came to an end in 1998 when there was a ceasefire, and that the peace agreement was signed in 2001. So it took 3 years for that peace agreement to be negotiated. It then took a further 18 years for the referendum to be organised. So things move slowly in Bougainville. What did become clear from the referendum is that the overwhelming majority of Bougainvilleans, or people living on the island, want their independence, with 98% or so voting in favour of it. That, though, does not mean that Bougainville will automatically become independent. The results are not binding on the Papua New Guinea authorities, and so one doesn't know exactly when Bougainville's independence will be achieved. Whilst it's understandable that the people of Bougainville want their independence, after all, their island is 700 kilometres away from the main territory of Papua New Guinea, and they're largely forgotten by the central authorities, one can't help wondering if they'll actually be better off as an independent nation. The civil conflicts that I mentioned occurred because of a dispute about the revenue coming from the Pangana mine in the centre of the island of Bougainville. Much of that revenue was being siphoned off by the central Papua New Guinea authorities, with relatively little of it being left on the island to benefit local people. However, with the war, things got even worse because the mine closed down, leading to the loss of jobs and livelihoods. Therefore, if Bougainville is to have a decent chance of economic prosperity in the future, then it urgently needs the mine to be reopened or for an alternative source of revenue to be found. If that doesn't happen, then this nation will risk becoming almost entirely dependent upon development cooperation and the Bretton Woods institutions. So in other words, there is a very real risk that an independent Bougainville will not become neither as rich or as independent as the people might have hoped. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and I represent the Shell Foundation. Now, the Shell Foundation is actually a charity that has been established by the well-known Shell Oil Group. And one of our projects currently is to try and reduce the indoor pollution generated by traditional cook stoves, and thus help to improve the lives and the health of women and children all over the world. Now, I think it's not generally understood that indoor pollution is just as harmful, in fact, probably more harmful than outdoor pollution. Half of the world's population, and actually up to 80% of rural households in developing countries, still cook today with traditional cook stoves using solid fuels like wood, for instance, or coal or animal dung. And in many cases, women cook around an open fire. It's placed in a pit, and then a pot is put on top of 3 large stones with the fire in the middle. Now, you can just imagine the amount of smoke and soot that this kind of traditional fire gives off. And of course, these fires are often indoors in small, cramped conditions. The World Health Organization estimates that 1.6 million people die every year of the health effects that result from this kind of toxic indoor pollution. And of course, the health problems affect disproportionately women and children who spend hours each day bending over the stove around the hearth. These traditional cook stoves and the pollution they generate can also cause chronic respiratory disorders and can even lead to blindness. So we have been working with researchers in the United States to produce a significantly improved but quite simple design of cook stove. The trick to this is to ensure that you can carefully control the amount of air that's pulled in to the stove and that feeds the fire. Now, what happens with traditional stoves, especially open fires, is there's a lot of air, and because there's too much air coming in, it cools the combustion process, and it means that not all of the fuel actually gets fully burnt. A lot of the remaining fuel is transformed into smoke and soot, containing very toxic products. So our stoves will be much more effective, will have careful control of the air intake, and so better combustion. Now, we're not the only ones to have worked on this. There have been many attempts in the past to promote improved cook stoves in India, in Bangladesh, in China. But when you go back a few years later, you see that people have reverted to the traditional stoves. This is because there haven't been sufficient efforts to get buy-in from the local population and to consult them about their traditional cooking practices. So what we're going to do is work with the women in villages, in rural areas. We are going to offer a range of different stoves, all simple in design. We're going to charge for them, because if you give something away free, it's not valued. Now, the cost will start at as low as $10 a stove, but we'll have a whole range. And to make sure these stoves are bought and used, we've got to get the women on our side. After all, the women who use cook stoves are consumers like any others. So what we're thinking of in the Shell Foundation is actually using a kind of marketing strategy that's worked very well with Tupperware, for instance, in which respected women in the community go round, make house calls to talk about these new stoves. And this could trigger real change. So thank you very much.